how do we know that you're not just doing parallelomania to find something similar in Joseph's life or his environment to the Book of Mormon?
These We're getting these same story arcs because I see them as the same. I see chiasm and what we're seeing in Mosiah 9 and 10, or the account of Ammon and Aaron, or the account of Noah and Replicash, or the account of Sherem and Korihor. How is it that these repeated things are being done? I mean, 9 and 10, it's just a it's just it's just a chiasm, but just done two different accounts in the same.
Um, I understand your point that Joseph was just able to orally dictate. He had this great memory, had all the points laid out in one order and then the other order. The thing that I find difficult to explain from Joseph's ability is even if he could have, just orally dictated chiasmus, this one having Zedekiah and Lord at the center and the suffix of kiah meaning Lord in Hebrew, and that being an argument to this isn't just a complex chiasmus, but faithful scholars or apologists would argue this is maybe the Hebrew making its way through, or it wouldn't work, I suppose, in English, but it does in Hebrew in the original language, so it would actually fit as a chiasm. It's strange that Joseph would have both Lord and Zedekiah at the center, and the suffix means Lord in Hebrew. What do you make of that? Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hi everyone, so before we dive into this episode with Ganesh Cherian and his friend David Eaton, I just want to say a few things. I think this was hopefully a really productive conversation. I really enjoyed it as well. I really appreciate Ganesh for coming back and to address a lot of the questions and some apologetic arguments as well. And I hope that we find the right balance of having a civil discussion. I tried to interject with a little bit more pushback and pushing with some more apologetics. And it was really nice to have his friend David, who is very nuanced but still a believing member, appreciative of the work Ganesh has done as well. And I think we had a good conversation. I'm hoping it will add to building bridges. And if people enjoy these interviews and these conversations, I really would appreciate at this time people, subscribing to the channel. Whenever I have checked the analytics, over 50% of people who watch have not subscribed. And channel growth has really been in a stunt recently. I've actually had my worst 3 months on YouTube with subscriber growth that I've ever had, which I don't fully know why. And I just noticed the channel isn't doing as well. And I really want to try to get it going again. And if you're someone who enjoys the channel, who watches frequently, things to help the channel to grow is liking, commenting, all those things help the algorithm. Sharing, if you have any social media platforms, Facebook, or if you use Reddit, sharing an interview like that, because I want to keep going with the channel. And, if the channel is going to go downhill, it's one of those things that I don't know if long term I would keep at it if it's not the sort of thing people want to watch. And if you think this content is valuable and you want it to reach more people, then please share. And if you're able and if you want to send any financial donations via PayPal or sign up to YouTube membership or Patreon, all those things just help me sort of financially to order books, to cover the cost of, filming, software, editing software, all those things as well. And it's also just appreciative for the time I put into it as well. But thanks for all those who do watch and hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Saint explores the church's history and truth claims. And this is part 2 of the interview that I'm doing with Ganesh Cherian and also his friend David Eaton, who is joining me from the UK, a fellow Brit, joining us today. And we're going to be discussing his book, Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism. We already did a part 1 where we talked about different influences or different topics in the book that Ganesh sees coming from either Joseph Smith's personal life or things in his milieu or environment or coming from the Bible. And in this part, Ganesh is willing to come back to respond to a lot more of people's questions about his book, his methodology, his approach, and also how he would engage and respond to some arguments in favor for the Book of Mormon, things pointing to ancient antiquity or ancient elements or complexity as well, which I appreciate because there's some people who are trying to figure out Book of Mormon historicity and authenticity, and they want to look at the critical arguments going against, but also things in favor and how, those who have naturalistic theories, how they account for that as well. So I think this will be an exciting episode, and I'm excited to have both of you on.
It's lovely to be here with you, Murph.
Good to be
It's
with you.
just lots of fun.
Brilliant. Well, maybe we could begin, Ganesh, for any who didn't watch part one. Could you maybe in a couple of minutes summarize sort of the thesis of your book in a nutshell? And then David, after that, I'd like you to sort of introduce yourself and your relationship with Ganesh and your thoughts on his book as well.
Sure.
All right, so yeah, gosh, this is the book, Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism. So it's a topical biography. So effectively, I go through Joseph's life topic by topic, and that means that I can look at how a particular idea tracks through the environment of early 19th century America, how an idea might influence or be a part of Joseph Smith's family dynamics, particularly the family that he grew up in, and then how this might impact him personally, and then have a look at basically what ends up in the Book of Mormon, because part of the whole kind of genesis of the book was looking at the idea that there's a lot of things that are in the Book of Mormon that don't kind of transfer to Nauvoo, or at least they're quite different. And so looking at the church that we have in Nauvoo when Joseph is 38 years old, and the Book of Mormon that is produced when Joseph is 23 years old, and trying to make sense of those two really key data points, because those are big deals for the church in general and what we end up implementing today.
Would you say that's sort
So
of like a unique approach because it's not just talking about topics or naturalistic sources for things in the Book of Mormon, but it's also talking about the evolution. Like there is that book by Charles Harrell, and This Is My Doctrine, but it does seem to be sort of a unique sort of approach or yeah, sort of niche to your book.
yeah, and yeah, that's been something that's been amazing actually, looking at those two kind of data points and then looking at the evolution. In fact, Charles Harrell, he was just at my house yesterday.
Oh, no
He and
way.
his
Speak of the
family
devil.
were visiting, and they were visiting New Zealand. And they came to my house in Wellington, so they just spent the last couple of days with me. They just left, but the one. So actually, I consulted him particularly. I've got various sections in the book. One on early 19th century colonial understanding, and then uh, the idea of Native Americans in the Book of Mormon, and then another section on theology. And I actually, Charles Harrell went through my theology section and uh, and looked through it, quantified it, made sure that I wasn't making any things that were or statements that were wrong, and just checked that through. So he was my kind of fact checker on my theology section. So yeah, the brilliant man, and he's tracked doctrines of the church throughout history, not just Joseph Smith's life, back through to antiquity, right through to the present day. But so mine's only just that really
There's more
small
focus on Joseph's
subsection,
life.
yeah, Joseph's life only. But it for me, it seemed to explain why we have differences between the Book of Mormon and the church that is established in Nauvoo, and primarily becomes the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Utah branch that we engage in today. So that looking at those two big data points and then realizing, gosh, there's a lot of little data points in between them, and then quite a few before Joseph was engaged with the Book of Mormon, and then also some after he dies, and kind of putting that all into a timeline so that you can track something through and figure out whether it's got any legs. What happened? Why did things change? Where did things pivot? Because there are a number of key issues in the Book of Mormon that are quite different, sometimes contradictory, by the time the saints reach Nauvoo and settle there. So and that's basically a good thesis. That the thesis is Mormonism is Joseph, Joseph is Mormonism. Those two you can't separate, and that's why when I looked at those two particular data points, it turned into a biography, because the only way I could explain the difference was Joseph Smith's life and his experience and the kinds of things that happened to him that changed his either his mind or the circumstances that forced him to have to consider alternative understandings.
And to be clear, your book as well, it's not arguing that Joseph was drawing necessarily on any, books or sources, maybe other than the Bible, but that a lot of this is coming from either his own personal life and family experiences or from his milieu and environment, political, religious things. And you will lean more with William Davis's theory of it being an oral dictation or oral performance, not that he had some pre-written manuscript or note. You would side with it. It's an oral dictation, but a lot of this is coming from Joseph's milieu, environment, and experience.
Absolutely. In fact, that's kind of what started me on the track was listening to William Davis's Sunstone presentation some years ago and hearing him talk about the Book of Mormon as an oratory production and recognizing some things that hadn't made sense up until he articulated them. And so then it made me look at the Book of Mormon with fresh eyes. In its dictation sequence, I'd always, Brent Metcalf's work on the Mosiah priority really was kind of influential to me too. But then when Bill Davis talked about the Book of Mormon as an oratory prediction, I started to see the Book of Mormon as an evolving work, not just a thing that was well. I couldn't make the connection that it was something that had been created in the past, and then Joseph was just reading it. Actually, I could see evolution in the text of the dictation sequence. I could see evolution in Joseph's environment that influenced the text, and these things just made more sense in terms of explaining what we have and why we have it. So that's essentially what I got there. So yeah, and it's been great. And the reason why we've got David Eaton on is because he's another Brit, so that's he's from the UK, so that means that he's a brilliant man. He's been a former state president in the UK, but also I met him through a really close friend in New Zealand who was from London, and and explained to him my ideas early on in the piece, really, really early on in the piece. David read a number of my kind of initial, drafts. He made comments. It's been fantastic, and he might tell you, but David Eaton's part of his role in the church has been looking at church history and working with particularly Keith Erickson out of the Church History Library, and trying to provide some reach out to particularly the European saints around church history and its complexity, and upskilling people with their understanding, but also trying to resolve tough questions, because there obviously are. And so that's what David's been engaged in for the last several years, and it's kind of been parallel to what I've been doing. So we've consulted a bit. He wrote a foreword in the book for me, but he's also reviewed much of the book prior to its printing, and also he could tell you a little bit more. And he does a podcast about church history subjects in that vein of the Church History Library's support. So it's and I figured that one of the reasons why I thought it would be really useful for this for us today to do that together for a number of reasons. One is that I get that we're talking about really tough subjects, and I'm talking about lots of things from a naturalistic point of view, and that can be really tough. Some of the comments in our previous podcast, people really confronted by what I did and saw me as an enemy, as an anti-Mormon or a Korihor, and that can't be further from the truth. I'm an active member of the church. Sure, I don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical and ancient, but I'm incredibly invested in my Mormon community, and David is active, believing, engaging in church history like I am, and 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 so one of the questions that we had that we talked about earlier was, does this kind of stuff destroy faith? And all of us are engaged in some tough subjects and really hard
Sure.
places. How do we, keep faith? How do we, engage in our communities that we love? How do we reach out to people with differing points of view or really strong emotions about things? And so I thought David would be a really good counter to me, but also really
Balance
great
things out as well.
balance. Yeah.
Yeah, because
And
you're right. This is a tough topic because, for many believers who, hold Book of Mormon historicity, they could see your book. It poses a threat, a challenge. I do want to say that I definitely do not support comments referring to you as, a core whore, or, I think it's definitely fair to say that somebody's, providing a naturalistic explanation, or come more from a critical perspective. But there can be a lot of demonizing and dehumanizing of people in this space. I think particularly before, judging the book by its cover. And I feel, and I think all of your believers or apologists is okay, not necessarily accept every claim, but let's read it before you judge or reject it, and seriously confront it as well, and to learn from some of the things that you're pointing out in your book and your research as well. And I think when we dialogue with each other, we can learn from each other and
yeah,
refine our positions. And I think it's finding a way that we can have more productive conversations where, even though we might disagree or come to a different conclusion, and we can ask hard questions of each other, that we don't have to see each other as enemies. Because as you say, you're still going to church. I can tell that even though as an unbeliever you still have some charity and love towards the church and Joseph Smith, or even the Book of Mormon in some sense as well. And I think we often want to have this echo chamber, this us versus them. So, but David, why don't
yeah.
we bring you in? Because I'm rambling. Tell us anything you want to elaborate about your background. And I think that's fascinating, your work in sort of church history and your former stake presence. So talk a wee bit about that, and then sort of your involvement with, Ganesh's work and your thoughts on this book.
Sure, thank you. I joined the church in 1972 at the tender age of 20. I knew nothing about the church prior to joining the church. I went on a mission, came back, got married, um, had of our children. Oh, and I got to serve in lots of different positions, and served as a stake president for 10 years, and then I served as a counselor in a mission presidency, and then I served on the National Public Affairs Council in the United Kingdom for 10 years. None of that actually matters or makes any difference, but just a bit of background. We raised our two children in the church, but and he became very negative towards the church, and he became very angry with us as his parents for raising him in the church, because he had concluded that Joseph Smith was not who he claimed to be, and that the Book of Mormon was not what it claimed to be. And so that kind of propelled my wife and I into a deep dive of church history and the issues that had troubled our son at that time. And most of these are contained in the letter to a CES director, which I'm sure you'll be very familiar with, and so probably will all of your listeners. We went through all of that, and we came out the other side, um, still with a faith in the gospel, and still believing that the church is true, and still believing that um, Joseph Smith was called of God, and was a prophet of God. And I think at that time, this would be about 2017, I wrote a blog called "Why I Still Believe, Why I Still Belong," and part of my table of epistemology of how I kind of put together my belief was my belief in the Book of Mormon, being a record that came from God. And part of that included things like the poetic parallelisms and the literary forms in the Book of Mormon, the Hebraisms, that seem to me to be part of the Book of Mormon, and that I have enjoyed so much and like. And so I put that out there. And I think one of the things that Ganesh picked up on was that he said that he didn't think that these were part of the Book of Mormon, or he didn't think that they were what I was suggesting that they were um, literary forms that were consistent with other Hebrew literary forms as well. And so that, I think, was where we kind of started. We connected through the mutual friend that Ganeshi has mentioned.
And
And
what
then he
year was that
says,
when you first connected?
that's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer, and Ganesh will now answer it.
I don't know, but it's been at least 5 years.
I
I
think
would
so.
say.
Okay, maybe
Yeah.
go back to
Maybe,
COVID time then.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe longer. It might be as far back to, um, might be back as far back to 10 years when we kind of first were connected. It was just after the gospel topic essays, and this particular mutual friend whose name is Charles Humphreys. He um he started a Facebook page, kind of inviting a lot of Kiwis and Brits into talking about the gospel topics essays. So that was back, 2015, so 10 years ago. And so Dave and I are both in that group and had made submissions over the years, and that's how we ended up kind of talking about some of these issues early on. And then once I started doing looking at these differences between the the Book of Mormon and the Nauvoo, which um, it wasn't really about a book back then. It was just really about trying to understand why there were some differences. That's when we connected on that. So it was right at the very beginning of the process. So David's been involved,
And
for at least 4 years while I've been writing on this book.
And Ganeshi very kindly sent me chapter by chapter as he drafted them, and I looked at them and went through them and made some comments and sent them back to him, and so that's how that situation really started. And yeah, as Ganeshi mentioned, I've always had an interest in church history, but since our children kind of declared that they were no longer going to be active in the church, and I started to dive deeper into church history, I really got quite interested in it. And I was invited by one of the Area 70 to join Keith Erickson's course online
Wow.
to help answer questions if people have questions to answer them and to kind of talk through the issues, or at least give them a forum to raise any questions that they might have. One of the criticisms that church leavers have is that there's often not an opportunity to kind of bring your question up to church leaders and to get answers to questions. And so I was
People
interested
who are
in doing that.
informed on a lot of these issues as well.
That's right. And I'm in a stake. I'm in the Coventry stake, and back in 2019, the stake president, I was a member of the stake council, and the stake president said, what is your biggest top of your worry list? So I wrote to him and I said, the top of my worry list is that we appear to be losing people in the church, so many good people. And it seems that some of them are going without really not only having their questions not answered, but sometimes not even asked. And so I suggested that we start in the stake an open forum where people can come, and it's a non-judgmental zone, and people can bring any questions they have, anything that they want to ask, and we'll talk about it and we'll discuss it. We may not be able to find an answer, but we'll discuss the concern that you have. And so he was very good about that, and he got behind that, and we did that. Started in 2019, and the last one we had was in this year in 2025. He's been released now as the stake president. The new stake presidency has come in. They don't feel quite exactly the same about it, and so for the time being, they don't wish to continue those. But so that was kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to start up a sort of a
So,
church history
so it was like a
insights.
forum you would have. Would you have like meetings or? classes or
Yes,
places where you would just discuss different church history topics or different concerns people have about, different truth claim issues or whatever it might be. And
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Every quarter or so, like 4 times a year, on a Sunday evening, the state presidency would send out an invitation to everybody to come to open forum, and people would arrive, and they'd send their questions in before the meetings, and sometimes they'd bring their questions with them. Didn't matter either way. And um, and the state president, we had a panel. I was asked to be the facilitator. We had the panel, and we would discuss the questions that they had. And we felt that that was a way that it would help people who had any concerns to raise them. We thought, perhaps naively, that it might help uh, stop people from leaving the church, and also naively, we probably thought that it might bring some people back. Whether it did either of those two things, I'm not too sure, but it was a lovely thing. We thought that we were doing, and we felt that it was the right thing to do at the time. And so then I started my kind of YouTube channel, podcast thing. It's called Church History Insights and Questions. And again, it's a place where people can raise any kind of questions that they have. And I
I
kind
can
of
link that in the description. I'm sorry to say I don't think I've heard or seen it, but I'd
no,
be
only one.
interested to check it out.
There are only about one or two people who have ever seen it, and that's fine. But it's there if anybody wants to look
It's a
for it.
great resource, and David is really lovely about explaining things. I must say, like I one of the reasons to bring him on is just that it, it, David is very matter of fact. He's very upfront. This is difficult. I don't necessarily know. These are the things I've thought about as I've looked at these things. Like he's very clever and articulate and compassionate, and I think that
Mm.
makes just yeah. Which I think, to aside, one of the reasons for my book really is to help build bridges because just like David was saying, with so many people feeling incredibly vulnerable around particularly church history questions, either because they have them or people that they love have them, and not really knowing answers, not really understanding how to build bridges or to even talk about some of these tough stuff. Um, so one of my main emphasis as for the book, which people, the feedback I've been getting has been really positive about, has been the idea of for for people who have left to feel validated. Yes, these are really tough issues. These are not small things that you've come across and feel terrible about. These are really significant things. So validating in that kind of a way, but also actually, if you look at Joseph Smith's life, he's a young man and he's evolving in the moment, and you can have a lot of empathy for a guy who maybe is figuring it out as he goes along, and he's making mistakes and changes, and it's evolving sometimes next to him rather than because of him. And then for people who are believers, oh, what are these issues that are challenging people, and to have some empathy to go, oh gosh, that might be not something that rattles me, but I can understand why it rattles
Yeah,
somebody
and to
else.
have that awareness and to be informed and to say, "Hey, I can understand why you're bothered by these issues or why you come to the conclusion that you do," even though people will come to a wide variety of different conclusions or interpretations or make different spiritual decisions. As you say, you're still active in the church and
Yeah,
the community, whereas other people will decide to step away. But I think it's understanding the different perspectives. And in part, I'm partly envious and think it's wonderful that your state created that space to just talk about these things in a way where you were still maybe trying to help people with faith, but to with maybe more of a nuanced perspective to talk about them. Because part of the reason I created this channel was because I had a lot of questions and issues and things I wanted to sort through, and I felt like I didn't have an outlet. I didn't really have anyone to talk to that I felt was informed and this has been a great, I guess, platform for me. But I think that's a really wonderful work and something that I wish more wards and stakes were doing.
Hmm, me too.
Yeah. All right. Well, so anything else you want to say before we sort of dive into your slides and your presentation?
Well, the other thing that I thought was kind of nice about the three of us, I mean, I recognize that we're all guys, and that's slightly, there's a whole segment of our population that is not being represented here, but there's also a segment of age, right? Like I'm, uh, uh, Stephen, you're young enough to be my son. I've got a
I think you
28 year
said you
old.
have a son my age.
Yes, I do, I do. And David's old enough to be my father. So
Wait, what? I thought
we
you were
have
older than him. What?
How rude is that?
Sorry, just kidding.
just
I'm
because
just
I
kidding.
look older than him
Is
is
that hair?
but the idea that there uh, between the three of us, we've got this multi-generation looking at these tough issues, and we're all humans and we're all individuals, so we're going to tackle it slightly differently. But there are some really interesting ideas about what it means to be a young person in the church navigating these things, what it means to be a middle-aged person in the church navigating these things, and what it means to be more senior in the church and navigating these things, because this is a community I would suggest that we all really love and we've invested in, and we have family and friends and community, and so these are we want to be part of the talking to each other rather than part of this other person is now dangerous because they believe this, or they're not attending or anything like that. I think one of the tricky things I have with the church is the church draws a very, very straight line down the idea that you're either faithful or you're an apostate. There is just, and that's just not real life. If you go to any ward,
Not
any
much gray.
yeah, but that's not what actually happens. If you go went to my ward in Wellington, you would see a huge spectrum of people, of differing belief. But the way that it's kind of framed is that you're one or the other, and generally the other is the people who are not who didn't turn up to church that day for some reason. So the idea that we can talk about these things and broker care and compassion, I think, is a really important part of the narrative. And just as an aside to that, one of the questions that was asked, which we've been talking for half an hour and we haven't got to any questions, but
No,
we've actually
this could be a long episode.
yeah, right. So, but I one of the things that one of the questions that we talked about answering is kind of one that we've been answering for the last half hour, and that is, one listener writes, ultimately tearing down the Book of Mormon's historicity provide a naturalistic explanation. Um, the church really does stand or fall on the Book of Mormon historicity, and Ganesh knows it. He himself might be morally okay with going to church for cultural reasons and still finding value in scripture manufactured from Joseph Smith's head. But if Joseph Smith was making it up, then it logically follows that there was no restoration, no priesthood authority, no prophetic calling. And for most people who came to that conclusion, they would also conclude that the whole church is a lie and therefore leave. And this commenter says, your book will destroy faith. The church's claims rise and fall on the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And so this is a question, is that the
Yeah.
case? And I hope that the last half hour that we've been talking suggests that everybody has a variation of belief. There are a lot of people who go to church for lots of different reasons, and and they engage in the ideas that the church provide, but they might not necessarily wholly subscribe to them. They might partly, or they might discard them. And one of those things might be the Book of Mormon. But I think it's for, and that's a significant thing. I'm not saying that it's not, but that there's a lot of people who go to church who don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical, and not ancient. And these are people that are sitting next to you in the pews. And these are even LDS scholars that we'll talk about as we go through the presentation today. So I don't think it's quite that simple.
Well, yeah, because
uh,
on the one hand, I relate with that listener's question because that's probably how it is for me. I'm
Right.
probably sort of see the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I don't know how for me to get away from the ancient origin claims and the historicity. They're kind of intertwined, but at the same time, for somebody who still believes it's either inspired fiction or sees spiritual value or that God was still involved in it, um, I'm not going to want to drive them out of the church for that. Book of Mormon historicity is actually even a temple recommend question. I understand there might be some people who still feel that they get spiritual value from it and still believe in, or still want to attend, because then I think we also need to honor that approach, even if that wouldn't work for certain people. And for some people, that if they lost belief in Book of Mormon history, they might step away. But everyone, as you said, approaches it differently and has certain things which is the motivator for their activity and involvement in the church and their belief in the gospel.
Yeah, exactly. I've actually got a quote from Elder Holland. So he was interviewed on this particular question, actually,
Oh,
in 2006 PBS interview, and he said about this: if someone can find something in the Book of Mormon, anything that they love or respond to or find dear, I applaud that and say more power to you. That's what I find too. And that should not in any way discount someone's liking a passage here or a passage there, or the whole idea of the book, but not agreeing to its origin or its divinity. I think you'd be as aware as I am that we have many people who are members of the church who do not have some burning conviction as to its origins, who have some other feelings about it, that is not as committed to foundational statements and the premises of Mormonism. But we're not going to invite someone out of the church over that any more than we would about anything else. We would say, this is the way we see it, and this is the faith I have. This is the foundation on which I'm going forward. If I can help you work towards that, I'd be glad to. But I don't love you less. I don't distance you more. I don't say you're unacceptable to me as a person or even as a Latter-day Saint if you can't make that step or move to that beat of that drum. We really don't want to sound smug. We don't want to seem uncompromising and insensitive. There are some things we can't give away. There are some foundational stones. If you don't have those, you don't have anything. So first vision, Book of Mormon. But he's basically saying, if you want to be there, if you want to belong, the Book of Mormon's not a mechanism, a thing that you have to hold strongly. The church might, but as an individual, you don't have to.
I appreciate that quote. I actually don't think I've heard it, at least not that full quote. And that definitely resonates a lot with me as well, and the different spectrums of belief. No, I could see somebody thinking and wanting to push back, but Ganesh, it's different. You could have this spectrum of belief, or you could still find value in the Book of Mormon, but maybe not believe it's historical, maybe that Joseph wrote it. But some might feel that what you've done is different because you've sort of gone public. You're advocating this book
Right.
that is undermining sort of Book of Mormon historicity and claiming that Joseph Smith wrote it in a very public way. So it seems that the implications of what you're doing is that it will erode faith, and almost like if you have those private views, but you still find value, that's one thing. But you're going out publicly and you're going to be damaging people's testimony. What would you say?
Well, actually, we can. Why don't we get to that?
Okay, you have some slides, don't you?
I have some slides, so why don't we do that? Let's have a look.
And we'll try not to jump around too much. In this episode, I want to address a lot of listeners' questions, and Ganesh has sort of organized them, and he's got slides on them, and some comments on the last videos. People want me to try to maybe interject a bit more, maybe push back a little bit more. This isn't going to be a combative debate. That's not really my style. But I appreciate that, Ganesh, you're willing to come on and engage with some of the apologetic arguments or ancient elements people have pointed to, and get your thoughts and perspective on it as well. I think that's important to listen to what are the other side, how do they account for or deal with some of those things in favor. And that's what I'm really interested in, as well as to see how you would deal with that, fitting that in with your model.
Great. Well, these are we had a number of questions, so we've been talking in the background, of course, and just talking about how we might deal with them. So I did a little idea of how we might do today. We might not be able to get through all of this because
we may not. We could always do a third part if needed.
Part three. So But the first was, the book, thesis, and use. Looking at some of those literary forms like Hebraisms and chiasmus and things like that. The understanding of voices and authors in the Book of Mormon, some stylometric evidence. Looking at some of the complexity of the Book of Mormon and understanding that in relation to Joseph and perhaps his ability in that. Looking at the witnesses and the what that means for the Book of Mormon, and then a little bit of archaeology, things like Nahum and volcanoes, some of the stuff that might suggest that there's connections to ancient ness of the Book of Mormon, some ideas around apologetics, and then the implications for faith and community with regard to some of this information. And we've just talked about that, so we've kind of covered off number 9, and we might talk about that a little bit more as
Yeah,
we
we could always
go.
touch on that again at the end. Maybe that might be a nice thing to end on as well. But I think this has actually been good, starting up this discussion this way and to talk about David's background and sort of that people come to different conclusions and interpretations, and how we can have civil dialogue and understanding with people who across the different faith spectrums.
Yeah, that's hugely important to me. I I have been a bishop, but it's my kind of personality. I like to build bridges. I'm huge into pastoral care. I want to see people thrive. I want to see to relieve pain. These are things that I incorporate into the kinds of work that I do, including my writing.
Very good.
So this is just that thesis that we talked about before. Book, Mormonism is Joseph. Joseph is Mormonism, and that the Book of Mormon for me is Joseph at 23 years old. His thoughts, feelings, his understanding of the world, and that's what gets encapsulated in the text. And then Nauvoo is Joseph at 38. He's a different person. He's a leader, both military, spiritually, civically. So he's quite, things that are happening to him in Nauvoo are quite different. So that's really the thesis of the book. This is actually, while we do
We
this,
should have David read this.
David, can you read this? This is David's forward to the book. Actually, he did the forward, so let's get him to read that.
I wrote this a long time ago. From Joseph's contemporary Alexander Campbell through Fawn Brody up to Dan Vogel, Richard Bushman, and many others. The idea that Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon of his own experience and recent circumstances was not new. It may not have been as thoroughly well presented or as clearly enunciated as Ganesh Cherian has done. The 10-year window concept and how so much had changed by the time Joseph gets to Nauvoo is compellingly set out. For me, the Book of Mormon remains a remarkable, beautiful, powerful, though enigmatic channel to the Ganesh's contribution, however, significantly adds to the speculative corpus on its origins.
Quite a nice endorsement.
I'm getting a lot of jerkiness in your.
Yeah, I think your connection's not the strongest there.
Oh,
David.
sorry.
Kind of reminds me of President Nelson's quote on Peacemakers when he says, "There's anything, kind or uplifting or bridge building that we can say about another person, we should." That seems coming from a believing Latter-day Saint, that this should be taken seriously. Probably one of the stronger naturalistic biographies for Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. It's on my shelf.
Fabulous, and thank you, David, for doing that for me and reading and commenting and giving me feedback. This is, I really appreciate that lots of people around the world gave me time, read stuff, and checked my work because I was doing such a comprehensive thing. I was covering lots of topics I didn't have a lot of um, specialized knowledge in, so it was really important. So here's maybe I'll
First
just
listener question. Do you want me to read it?
yeah, hang on, I'll just go maybe back to your original question. All right, yeah, maybe yeah, we'll just read that. How's that?
Yeah, no problem. So the first paragraph, that's coming from a listener, and then I sort of summarize underneath.
Okay, good.
So this is someone who commented. So one thought I had was that critics similar to Ganesh like to point out that the Book of Mormon was mirroring Joseph's life, but I see the Texas sharpshooter fallacy in this argument. And he says, much like critics complain of apologists, for example, chiasms, the problem is that almost every story can be boiled down to a similar arc. So you could easily assert that Joseph Smith is leveraging other material. You can say that because he has siblings and Nephi has siblings, Nephi's story is just about Joseph Smith. Or because Joseph Smith moved around, Nephi had to move and flee, but this is very reductive. So I sort of summarized by saying, how do we know that you're not just doing parallelomania to find something similar in Joseph's life or his environment to the Book of Mormon? And for example, I remember reading through Dan Vogel's biography, and he talked about, like King Noah, and he would drink wine and have wives and concubines. And he sort of said, like, this could have been coming from Joseph Smith Sr., who had a drinking problem, or when Limhi and his people were in bondage to the Lamanites, that's Joseph when he's in bondage as a tenant on Isaac Hill's property. And I remember at the time thinking, like, it's kind of speculative or kind of parallelomania a bit. Like, I can understand from a naturalistic explanation, if Joseph's the author, then you might be looking for what could have been the inspiration. But a believer might look at that and say, like, this seems a little bit like parallelomania. Is there some of that when you're pointing to things in Joseph's life? Is there any fairness to that? What do you think about that?
So yeah, gosh, you can the Book of Mormon has brothers arguing, and who hasn't been in a family? I've got five boys. Arguing boys is part of the course, right? I can that's certainly something that happens in lots of people's lives. There are some things, and well, there's two things for me for the book. One is the book's not just about the Book of Mormon, right? It's about Joseph Smith's whole life and how it fits in. And so, hopefully, if you're reading my book, you're looking at a whole arc of Joseph's life and how different things play out. And I give an idea of where these ideas might have come from, how they implement on Joseph's life, and where they go after the Book of Mormon and the beginning of the church, right through to Nauvoo. And so nobody has to accept that, of course, but hopefully I've done my homework. I've got 1,350 references, so you can check that these things happened or were happening in and around Joseph. And also the book gets more specific as it goes on. So, for instance, the first section is really about early 19th century America and some of the ideas that were swirling around in that time frame that I believe affect Joseph's own personal life, but also then the text of the Book of Mormon. But by the end of the book, I really focus down on things that are really specific to Joseph and his particular culture in Western New York. And a lot of that's the last section's about folk magic. And so we see things like seer stones and slippery treasures, guardian spirits. And these things, when you see them in the text of the Book of Mormon, so the Book of Mormon talks about slippery treasure. The Book of Mormon talks about seer stones that reveal and translate text. These are things that are really specific to Western New York, particularly New England refugees who ended up in Western New York, to Joseph Smith's family and the people around his neighborhood. And these are things that didn't translate very well when they went to places like Ohio and Missouri and Nauvoo, because when they're gathering with other people from different parts of the United States and England, those people didn't come from those cultures. And so those things don't make much sense, but they make really specific sense to Joseph's really narrow folk magic culture that he grew up in. And so, yes, there are some things which we all can feel very, as we read the text, and we can go, gosh, I've had that kind of experience myself. So we're encouraged to apply the scriptures to ourselves. But there are some things that we just can't, like slippery treasure. When was the last time, something that you buried got whisked away underneath the ground? Well, just doesn't happen. You might have, forgotten where you buried it, or forgotten where you hid your money in your house, and I guess you could feel like that was slippery treasure. But the idea that there's some force or curse that moves things outside of your realm, well, that's really specific to 19th century early folk magic history. And it's
what if
really
I would offer a
specific.
quick sort of pushback to that? Because yeah, on the one hand, yeah, the slippery treasures and the curse upon the land, I see the folk magic illusion. Somebody might say that, well, it doesn't, reference guardian spirits or them doing this folk magic sort of rituals. And, I believe Blake Oster's pointed to some similarities to it in the book of Deuteronomy with sort of their riches being cursed if they aren't being righteous or not living up to the covenant, and maybe with like soil erosion or things they could possibly naturally just sink, and it's not necessarily clearly Joseph putting in his folk magic or slippery treasures, although I can certainly understand that interpretation. What do you think of that quick alternative explanation?
Look, we can do that with maybe one thing, but if we have to do that with 50 things, that gets a little bit tricky, right? So, um, yeah, I spend a lot of time in the book, trying to be as specific as possible, and you can uh, accept it or reject it as you want. I think one of the powers of the particular book is what happens to that idea post the Book of Mormon, what happens to it as it goes into the early church, what happens to it when the church moves from New York to Ohio to Missouri to Nauvoo. How are those things changing because of the other cultural aspects of the makeup of the church? I think that gives weight to the idea, or at least that's what I try and show in the book, that these are specific to Joseph. And then as his circumstance and the people around him change, uh, those narratives also change, and they change quite significantly in really documentable ways that also show that it's, that he's being influenced, or that things are changing because of the makeup of the people involved. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Nope, that's grand. Shall we move on to the next slide? And feel free, David, at any point if you have any comments or questions you want to interject with as well.
Yeah, we'll do.
All right. Do you want to read these?
Yes, I'll read that. So this was, again, two listeners. I think these are two separate questions. So they asked, why has he come to such different conclusions about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith than many trained historians such as Richard Bushman, Mark Ashurst McGee, Stephen Harper, Garrett Dirkmatt? Where does his work most disagree with specialists, and what evidence led him there? What would change his mind? I guess, should we address that one first? So we're saying that there's some believing historians and scholars who may not come to the same conclusion. Now, of course, there are also unbelieving, scholars and historians. So it's not that all faithful historians are led to the conclusion, or all historians are led to the conclusion the Book of Mormon is historical. But what would you quickly say to why you see some of these trained scholars or historians who are competent, not being persuaded or come to the same conclusion as yourself or other unbelieving historians?
So we all have our biases, obviously, and being a member of church is a huge identity, and particularly if you work for BYU, or you are really close to the church education system, you are highly motivated to find things or conclude things that are in line with who's paying you. I would suggest that that's a big deal. We're going to talk about that a little bit more
Can I
in a
just give
couple
a
of
brief
slides.
comment to that? Because I think that's true to an extent, but I often sometimes, for example, might hear like John Dillon or other critics sort of making those arguments that they're making arguments to defend the Church of the Book of Mormon because their salary depends upon it. acting like they may not have any financial bias themselves for the content or the arguments they make as well. But I think it's true that, like, if you're employed as a BYU professor or a scholar or apologist, that will have an influence on the conclusions you come to. But I also think for many of them, at least for my interactions, I think many of them are sincere believers and have sincere
Oh,
testimonies, and it's not about the money. And I think vice versa for critics. I don't want to make the argument that John Dillon's just attacking the church for money. I don't really like those sorts of arguments, but it's important to be aware of those biases.
yeah, and I think yes,
Everybody, sorry, Ganesh,
you go.
everybody is biased.
Yes,
Can you hear me okay? Yep,
we can.
okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
So everybody is okay. Everybody is biased. Um, I'm biased and you're biased and Ganeshi is biased and every single historian that's ever done anything is biased. But it is possible, I don't think it would be true to say that it's not possible for any historian who is employed by the church to be able to be also independent and thoughtful and to abide by the rigors of historical research process. And uh, I think it is possible. So I think it, well, whoops, sorry, dog, dog just attacked me. So whilst it's possible that there will be probably some church historians who you might say kind of in a sense you're implying that they're towing a corporate line, and perhaps that's true, but I don't necessarily think it's true of everybody.
Yeah, well said.
yeah, and look, I'm not saying that these people aren't sincere. Everybody is absolutely sincere. People are motivated, obviously, and they have bias, but we all generally believe that we are caring, compassionate individuals who want the best and are looking at these things in the best light. And I haven't met these particular um, uh, people in person, but I've met a number of really just incredibly genuine, amazing um, employees of BYU in the scripture language field who are absolutely gold. They're just brilliant people who care deeply and who produce really good stuff. It's not that they but it but they're motivated to produce stuff in line with the the ethos that they're trying to support.
Sure. Yeah.
That's just the reality, and um and and we have seen a number of people who once they are no longer employed by BYU, they are able to be a lot more um, candid. Would be the answer to that question. And we talked about one just now, right? Charlie Harrell. He was a BYU professor in engineering, but he wrote, "This is my doctorate," and he was only able to do that kind of when he retired. Um, he would not have been able to continue being a BYU professor um, if he had published that book while he was while he was there. It's just you know, so it's tricky. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I guess the part of that is uh, maybe we could just can we read the next question and I guess
Yeah.
and I'll kind of link them together maybe.
Yeah, kind of builds onto it. So this is kind of three questions in one, but feel free how you want to respond to them. So I think this is a separate questioner says, I'd also like to know how his work differs from other pious fraud theorists such as Von Brody, Grant Palmer, Dan Vogel. Is he just repackaging older critiques? And also, as a non-historian, how does he avoid biases such as cherry picking and making interpretive leaps or turning complex evidence into neat narrative arcs? So there's kind of like a couple of different questions. How does it differ from the prior sort of biographies or theories, past fraud theories of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon? Are you just drawing upon that? And then, if you're not a trained historian, could you just be cherry picking things, or how good is the scholarship, shall we say?
Yeah, and I kind of refer back to the fact, gosh, in order to make this book, I had to consult dozens of people. So I've consulted, lots of, LDS scholars across the world. I would probably, put David into that camp too. I consulted him, but Charlie Harold looked at the whole section on theology. Thomas Murphy looked at the whole section on Native Americans. I had Matt Harris look at the chapters I did on slavery and white supremacy. I had Amanda Hendricks Komodo look at the section I did on patriarchy. I had John Lunwell look at the section on folk magic. I had um, uh, I, so and many others. Like I had to engage a lot of different people. They were incredibly generous with their time. Fortunately, the chapters are small, like um, uh, like short stories, so that and independently, ask them about this trajectory and sort of. So I tried to avoid bias as much as possible by farming out to different people on different subjects, looking at what I'd said and giving me feedback on whether they thought it was um, applicable and reasonable or not. So that's why I try to avoid bias and cherry picking and making interpretive leaps, or turning the complex evidence into narrative arcs. I guess the difference between my work and others like Fawn Brody or Grant Palmer or Dan Vogel even, would be that I've, looking at each subject and looking at that trajectory over the chronology of Joseph's life so you can see one thing at a time. So hopefully, you can choose which ones you might engage with that are important to you, but also that they build as a group to be able to show that there's a common narrative arc, which I would suggest is Joseph's evolving maturity. He's 23 years old when the Book of Mormon is produced. He is 38 years old when he dies, and he's quite a different person. He's a farm boy who's not known in 1829. He's a religious leader who's being talked about across the world by 1844. So these are that difference in maturity and exposure is massive, and that accounts for lots of the changes that happen to him personally, but also to the theology, the practice of the church, the understandings that people have. So those are the ways that I've tried to do that. I would suggest that the question before said, what would change my mind? So we have scholars who are attached to the church, maybe being paid by the church, who have a particular narrative. We have those who have left church employment who then often provide a different narrative, and but doesn't necessarily mean they're not faithful any longer. They just might talk about things differently after they're out of church employment. And so the thing that would change my mind, if there is somebody who is outside the church who is validating the kinds of things that paid employees of the church are also sharing. So I've got two examples. And this, so Dan McClellan is, a credible biblical scholar. He's well regarded across
TikToker
the world.
with
Famous TikToker.
who know over like 1 million subscribers.
Yeah, he used to work for the church up until a couple of years ago as a scripture language translating supervisor, and he is a current active member of his ward in Helaman, Utah, and he's sidelined from his ward. Because he doesn't believe in a historical Book of Mormon. This is his. He did an interview, and this is his. I put this in the front of my book, but this is his thing. Do you want to read that, Murph? Maybe.
Yeah, yeah. So this is Dan McClellan. Is this when he was on his Mormon Stories interview?
Yes, yes, correct.
Yeah. So he says the data indicate that the Book of Mormon is a product of the 19th century from a scholarly method how do you say that word? Methodical. From a scholarly methodical approach to the Book of Mormon, there aren't really serious arguments that it is anything other than the product of the 19th century. Those are fighting words. From a position of faith, absolutely people can believe it is of ancient origin, but that is a position of faith. That is a position that is existing despite what the data indicates, despite the evidence, not the data that are built upon the evidence, even for folks who do accept it as something of ancient origin. I have long argued that if you want to understand it better, you need to approach it as something at least addressing a 19th century audience.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, obviously this he's a biblical scholar, so he talks about biblical stuff. He doesn't talk about the Book of Mormon very often, but when he does, these are the kinds of things that he says. Um, and I would suggest that my book kind of fulfills his idea. You know, if we looked at the Book of Mormon in its 19th century context to a 19th century audience, you know, that you'd be able to understand it better. And so, actually, that's one of the things I think my book can do is help uh, explain and give you some context about the ideas in the Book of Mormon against its environment and its audience, which I think is really important. But here's a person who is faithful in the church. He attends church. He is sidelined by his ward because he has this position. They he recently told me, you know, they got him to teach Old Testament, but the moment that was finished, they sent him back to primary. So he's currently a primary teacher in his ward.
Mm.
Um, uh, but there's lots of people who you know, when he was the gospel doctrine teacher on the Old Testament, there were tons of people who came back to church just to hear him speak on the Old Testament. Because they, you know, he's
I
so
find those
well
very
regarded.
fascinating
Yeah.
Sunday school lessons. And, you know, I don't really want to talk too much on Dan McClellan personally. There's
No.
some believers who sort of feel that, you know, he's active, but he's sort of arguing against a historical Book of Mormon. People is feeling that he's not really a believer. I'm sort of like, I'm open. I'm still, like, as we talked about before, welcome for people to come, even if they hold a wide variety of views. And I think his last part, whether or not you believe it is an oral dictated text that Joseph is the author, or you hold that it's a translation of an ancient text. I do agree that to understand it, it's to understand the 19th century audience, and that if you believe it's a translation, it's a 19th century translation of an ancient text. So I do agree with that, to understand it in light of the 19th century environment and context. I think we can be sort of somewhat united there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I would suggest my book is in line with what he's said and the position that he holds.
Could I just jump in with a quick question to Ganesh about sources? Would that be okay?
Oh,
Yeah,
of course.
absolutely.
Um, I just wondered, Ganesh, to what extent you looked at Terrell Given's work on the Book of Mormon.
Oh,
Is
like by
that,
the hand of Mormon.
yeah, that's one of his. I think he's written a number of books, sort of about Book of Mormon and so forth. I'm not sure that I saw any source references to Terrell Givens in your book, but did you look at any at all, or not?
Not his work on the Book of Mormon so much as I read several of Terrell's books, and
Okay.
they're lovely. I find them, you know, I I really like the way that Terrell explains things, the way that he comes across. You know, so yeah, love his he's probably the technical side. I'm not, you know, I don't necessarily agree with completely, but his feeling for and the way that he talks about things, I incredibly like.
Mm.
Can I just ask a quick
Thank you.
follow-up sort of on the previous question, on the previous slide, not to belabor the point too much, but I think what the person was sort of getting at, about avoiding biases and interpretive leaps is they might say, like, how much of your book was you sort of already came from the position it's not historical, Joseph is the author, and then when you wrote this book, how much of it was trying to find all the evidence that fit with that, sort of finding all the pieces of the puzzle that fit with that conclusion that you have, and not maybe dealing with all the things that might go against that, if that makes sense, and feeling that was there some sort of bias and you were just looking for the evidence that would support that conclusion. How would you address someone who has that question?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question, and I guess it speaks to the evolution of the book in general, right? I said before that I looked at the Book of Mormon, I looked at the what we have in the latter church, and tried to figure out why the difference between the two, what has happened, and then as I looked at the differences, recognizing that it was Joseph that was the main reason for the differences, and then yeah, just found as I did more research, most of my research was on the Joseph Smith papers. Like the vast majority of the sources and the references are what the primary documents from the Joseph Smith papers can kind of give. So as things got um, yeah, I think that some of the methodology was looking at these issues and then seeing where those issues were in the timeline. So, for instance, if I'm talking about things like speaking in tongues, that's a really strong practice of the early church. It's referred to in the Book of Mormon, but by Nauvoo, it's not a practice that they're engaging in a public way. So some private stuff going on, but not necessarily public, and it obviously is not something that we do currently in the church now. So as I'm looking at the Joseph Smith papers and I'm looking at various sources and I'm reading them and I come across something in Joseph Smith's journal about speaking in tongues, for instance, I'd be slotting it into, okay, well, this is in 1834. This is the engagement that Joseph is having with speaking in tongues, and this tells us where he is at in the timeline. And then there's another reference in 1842, say, and now this tells us about how people are feeling and interacting with speaking in tongues in 1842. So, and those seem to create a great deal of consistency, because you could see that speaking in tongues was really important in the early church. They're doing it, they're engaging with it, people are being converted by people speaking in tongues. And then you see that those references start to change, the ways that people are dealing with speaking in tongues changes, the ways that it's being talked about over the pulpit in sermons, the ways that Joseph Smith is referencing them in his journal, those things are changing. And so it's clear by 1844, speaking in tongues is not something that Joseph is engaging in, at least not publicly, and it basically disappears from the practice of the everyday saints. So that's why we don't have it today, even though it was such a really big part of the beginnings of the church. So that's kind of how things happen. Now, in order to do that research too, I looked at BYU articles on speaking in tongues. If anybody had something along those lines, I tried to include them. But that's just so much information. Sometimes I'd never be finished with the book if I
And
speak
in
my time.
fairness, I think nobody could write a book that would account for everything, all the arguments in favor, and every criticism and argument against. That would be an incredibly long book. So you can never look at every single argument for or against for the Book of Mormon or be completely thorough. But you feel, certainly on the topics that you explored, you feel like it was a thorough analysis or overview, going from 1830 with Joseph Smith up until Nauvoo.
Yeah, that's right. And and to be fair, like I there are some things that are out of place, and I try and highlight them in the text. You know, oh gosh, they've gone back to this idea when it seems like they had abandoned it prior. Why is that? You know, those kinds of things. But yeah, in many ways, that's the thesis, right? I've started to see a pattern. I produced the pattern. I've found evidence, you know, detailing the pattern, and that just repeated again and again and again. That's why I think the pattern's so robust. Um, yeah, no, so far nobody has come back and said you've got this completely wrong. They are, you know, this is an aberration of what's happened. So I'm open to that though.
I've got a couple of scholars who have reached out to me who maybe in the future might be willing to come on, and they've read through your book and want to go over some things. And I think that's good. It'll add to
Oh,
the conversation. And you seem like you'd be open to any critique or feedback, and I think, you know, all engagement is positive because I guess scholarship and different perspectives we learn from each other. So you have that to look forward to as well. But okay, I
absolutely.
think we've addressed those pretty well.
Yeah. So yeah, that's Dan McCullen's work. Another great scholar is Richard Bushman. This is from his interview with back in 2015 with uh,
Was that Bill Real?
Bill Reel. Yes,
Huh.
and I wondered, David, can you read that for us?
Sure. I think right now the Book of Mormon is a puzzle for us. Even people who believe it heartily in every detail, it's a puzzle. And to begin with, we've got the puzzle of translation. Translating the book without the plates even in sight. They're wrapped up in a cloth on the table. So it's not something that comes right off the pages, the characters on the plates. So we don't know how that works. And there is the fact that there's phrasing everywhere, long phrases that if you Google them, you'll find them in 19th century writings. The theology of the Book of Mormon is very much 19th century theology, and it reads like a 19th century understanding of the Hebrew Bible as an Old Testament. That is, it has Christ in it the way Protestants saw Christ everywhere in the Old Testament, close quote.
Yeah, so you know, Richard Bushman's incredibly well regarded along, you know, as well as Dan McClellan, and these are faithful members of the church who certainly believe that there is a significant 19th century element to the Book of Mormon, to its text. So, you know, I don't think I'm out of line with scholars. And the thing that might change my mind is, in reaction to the previous question, is the idea of if there's somebody outside of the church who validates the text of the Book of Mormon, then I'd be totally open to that. And I think that one of the challenges we have is that we can prove, we can show, and there's a number of, you know, even faithful members, Colby Townsend would be one of them, who show that the Book of Mormon text is dependent on Joseph and things like the Adam Clarke commentary. It's dependent on a King James version of the Bible. You know, it's not the other way around. It's not that the Book of Mormon preserves a more ancient uh, text of Isaiah, or that the Book of Mormon preserves a more ancient understanding of Jesus Christ in 600 BC, because there's no other text other than the Book of Mormon that suggests that the ancient Israelites were practicing Christianity, you know, hundreds of years before Christ actually came. The and those kinds of things would be massive. Like they would be great finds, but they would make people's careers if they were able to show them. But people can't show them. And Dan McClellan, you know, he's a biblical critic. If he could show that the Book of Mormon was uh, independent of the 19th century, of the text that Joseph has available to him, he would do it because it would be groundbreaking. It would be, as a scholar, that would put your name right up there. But the reality we have is that the Book of Mormon is dependent on the texts available to Joseph in the 19th century. And I would suggest from the book that the Book of Mormon is dependent on Joseph Smith himself. So, the thing that would change my mind is if somebody independent, somebody outside the faith, then could point to the idea that something in the Book of Mormon, was ancient, and uh, gave us greater understanding to antiquity, then that would certainly be something, and something that I would take very seriously.
So I've got a couple of comments. The first thing I want to say is one, I think whenever I read through Graham Palmer's book, and still this day, I think the King James Bible is throughout the Book of Mormon, both Old and New Testament passages, which can pose a challenge. Certainly, you might be able to reconcile the vernacular being translation, but New Testament passages and even some phrasing sounding similar to revivalist sermons or conversion experiences. I find that quite plausible. When it comes to in certain 19th century texts, I don't find the late war, the first book of Napoleon very, very strong, but I do sort of agree with that. I don't know how familiar you are with Margaret Barker's scholarship. I just want to mention for people who'd be like, Murph, you should have mentioned. And I don't know if there would be this full consensus of Bible scholars for this, but she would be a non-Latter-day Saint Bible scholar who saw some of the early chapters of First Nephi fitting with sort of the political and religious context in Jerusalem before Josiah's reform, sort of around 600 BC. And she posited that the ancient original temple tradition had, El, who was the God Most High, and Yahweh, who was the son of the God Most High, who is this atoning Messiah. And then with the reforms of Josiah was this de-emphasis and removal of, Asherah and the centralization of the religion, and also this de-emphasis of an atoning Messiah. A lot of Book of Mormon scholars have found her scholarship interesting because it sort of aligns with our scholarship and views, and that, oh, okay, this actually could account for Christ being there sort of in Old Testament times. Now, she is a non-Latter-day Saint Bible scholar, but I don't believe that her view is necessarily the mainstream, and I think there's definitely a spectrum on Josiah's reforms, but I think some of that's sort of interesting, and I think people should look at her arguments and her scholarship on that.
Oh, look, I'd love to hear Dan McClellan's take on that, because as a biblical scholar, I'm sure he'd be incredibly interested about anything that tied the Book of Mormon through to an ancient setting. That would
I should
be.
send him. I wonder if he's actually addressed Margaret Barker's scholarship in a video. If not, I should either yourself or I should send him a video. But I do believe that it's not mainstream, or not everything. They would agree with some things that she posited, but maybe not everything. But the other point I was going to make was, you would believe if sort of non-Latter-day Saint historians or Bible scholars or archaeologists sort of verified things. What if somebody said that that's sort of a fallacy of like appeal to authority, or sort of like the bandwagon fallacy, that if it's popular, if it's accepted by everybody, then you would believe it. But what if somebody said like, well, what if there's just really strong arguments or evidence? Would that not convince you, even if other people wouldn't accept it, because they might be like, but I can't accept the religious implications of, the supernatural and the angel and gold plate, so they might, not accept the evidence. But would you not be convinced if for you just looked at it and thought, I think it's compelling, even if non-Latter-day Saint scholars aren't convinced?
Well, then that becomes a question of faith, which I'm happy with, right? That's absolutely fine. Um, for me, I guess my concern is dependency. The If I can find the if the Book of Mormon could be independent of the Bible, that would be a really great thing to show. It would help me, to give a lot more credence to it. But because the Book of Mormon is dependent on the King James Version, that is available in Joseph Smith's environment, that becomes an issue, right? Because, it, it's the kind of back to when we were missionaries and we went, okay, well, this is an independent witness. This is the witness of the Americas, and it's independent of the witness that was happening in Mesopotamia, but or Israel, right? So those are the kinds of things that I said as a missionary. That this confirms this. That's just not the reality. The Book of Mormon is dependent on what has already been available to a 19th century audience. It's not independent of what is available to a 19th century audience. And that is a really big distinction. So if somebody could find something that's independent, that's great. And that would be really worth looking at it really strongly because, yeah, but we just don't find that. Colby Townsend's work on that is really, amazing. I have enjoyed his scholarship a great deal and that and looking at dependency, particularly in Isaiah, and first and second Isaiah, third Isaiah. Those kinds of things are really big issues for the Book of Mormon being historic and ancient. What we expect to see is not what we do see. We see dependency. We don't see independency.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next slides. Okay. So maybe before we get on these specific things, I think that there's many people, listeners who probably who are listening to my channel who come from maybe a similar perspective of, they're nuanced, they are aware of the criticism, the naturalistic explanations. I, for a time, sort of was very convinced by Grant Palmer's theory, and then I think William Davis has a good theory, and I have a lot of respect and almost have like these two working models, shall we say, when it comes to the Book of Mormon. And I think what many people feel, coming from maybe more of a nuanced perspective or who are believers or apologists,
We lost
is...
Murph.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Oh gosh, you're still on there, but
I'm still here. Yous are both frozen.
maybe well, I'll keep going and then hopefully you come back.
Am I okay? Am I frozen?
Oh, we lost you for a minute.
Oh, hold on. Oh no, it's saying my connection is unstable. Oh, flip's sake. Am I back? Am I okay?
Yes.
Yep, you're back.
Okay. Right. I'll maybe edit that bit out. So yeah, most people who listen to my channel or people who are maybe in a similar situation to myself, they're probably aware of the criticisms, the naturalistic explanations. I myself, sided with the naturalistic explanation. I was very convinced by Grant Palmer's book when I read it and then was reading through Dan Vogel and such. But what many of us would be most interested in is how your naturalistic explanation or how you account for what people see as either very complex features or ancient elements in the text, things that feel like don't seem to fit with Joseph being the author, and they might see some of it as compelling evidence for ancient antiquity. And yeah, to see how would you account for it, how do you deal with that, how can you undermine it, those sorts of things. So I think we're going to dive into literary forms in the Book of Mormon. Anything you want to say that before we dive into the question, or shall we just approach the first one?
Yeah, just I grouped these three questions together because they talk about very similar things and just the literary forms. But yeah, go through it.
Okay, so the first one is, how did Joe Smith know to construct ancient Hebrew legal forms? So this comes from a listener. Covenant legal structure, prophetic lawsuits, when Hebrew scholars didn't even recognize these forms until the mid-20th century. Was Joseph a genius who uncovered these forms before educated scholars could? Or is there new scholarship found contemporary to Joseph Smith's time and accessibility? And it was, whenever I interviewed and read through the article by Blake Ostler, he talked about both prophetic lawsuits as being sort of these ancient forms, but also with King Benjamin's farewell speech and his sermon having some connections to an ancient covenant renewal sort of ceremony, and a kingly coronation, it being this farewell speech. And other scholars have pointed to, like, the pitching of the tent similar to the Feast of Tabernacles. And Grant Palmer, other critics would say this is just a clearly Protestant sermon, but whenever I looked at some of their arguments or scholarship, I think it's interesting connections. And somebody could say, hey, this could also be read, that these are ancient connections and not clearly modern. What's your thoughts on that scholarship and those connections? And do you find it persuasive? And do you think that Joseph could have had access to any of this in his environment or from the Bible? How do you account for that?
So that's a good question. I'm in no way a Hebrew scholar, or
Neither am
a
I.
neither I. But so the thing whenever I approach this, or particularly recently when I'm doing the book, I think to myself, okay, well, are these things present in Joseph's world? Um, because I mean, one of the things that we have a challenge with, and it'll come up a little bit later, is that nobody knew Joseph before the Book of Mormon. He was a nobody to no one, right? Just such a so. But whether these things are in his environment is a really interesting question, and that is, are people in? We know people are engaging in the Bible. The Adam Clarke commentary was incredibly popular in the early 19th century America. We know that at least one of Nathaniel Lewis had a copy of the Adam Clarke commentary. These were things that people engaged in with regard to literary form. They were interested in the makeup of the Bible. They were interested in how it was constructed. They were interested in how different forms, and of course, these are the basis of telling stories in general. You know, we how do you um, construct poetry? How do you tell a story um, with a theme and also a lesson and come to some conclusions? These are ways in which we communicate in a literary way to others the ideas that we have about our world. So, and these are the forms that are happening in the King James version of the text that most early 19th century Americans are engaging with. So while they might not have had names for them, um, you know, they recognize them. These are smart individuals, and if you read a lot of text, and I've had to as part of the writing of the book, um, read sermons from other early 19th century uh, preachers, they're engaging in the text of the Bible in some really complex ways. They are talking about its form, they are talking about its construction, they are identifying stories and narrative arcs, they're showing comparisons between texts. These are things that are just happening in the early 19th century. In fact, I think that biblical literacy in early 19th century America was really high. People engaged in this because it was very common to have a Bible. That's probably the one thing that you had in common with your neighbor. So while for me, while these things are just present in Joseph's life, I don't know that he necessarily had words for them or names for these types of things, but they are absolutely present in the King James version of the Bible that he's engaging with.
So
So
you're saying you think Joseph might have picked up on this from the Bible and subconsciously been aware of it because people were studying it so closely. I guess the listeners' question and what faithful scholars probably say is that this wasn't really, apparent to scholars, these ancient forms. And then the fact that it shows up in the Book of Mormon, it's very unlikely that people were aware of it in Joseph's time. Now, you're positing that they might have been, but they might say, well, do you have any evidence that they were aware of this,
well,
these
these things
specific
are
ancient
not
forms?
well, these are things are not unique to the Book of Mormon, right? That you could make that case if it was completely unique to the Book of Mormon, but it's not. You find these same literary forms in other texts of the time. They
Well,
are,
in King Benj, I have this is from Stephen Ricks. He says King Benjamin's speech follows the essential pattern of the covenant renewal formula found in ancient Israelite and Hittite texts. He's observed that King Benjamin's speech contains six elements of a covenant renewal formula. I just read that. The ideal was that the new king taken to office before the death of the old one and the transfer of power was connected with the ceremony in which the people make or renew their covenant with God. So there's like a preamble, a review of God's relation with Israel, terms of the covenant, formal witness, blessings and curses, reciting and depositing the covenant. So are you saying that you think this would have been accessible, or there would have been something similar to these ancient forms in other 19th century texts? Like whenever I brought this up to Brent Gardner, he even said that this could just be finding connections, and it may not even be a slam dunk. This is an ancient form in the Book of Mormon. But how would you approach that?
So again, I don't know that I can suggest that this is independent of the environment that Joseph is currently in. Particularly, when we talked about this the last time when we had our podcast, that the type of, I get, what's being discerned here is the covenant renewal process. The type of covenant making that King Benjamin engages in the text of Mosiah 2 and 3 is also exactly the same as the kinds of conversion experience that the people are having at revival meetings. And we talked about this last time, that there's no baptism in King Benjamin's speech. He does not identify baptism as a mechanism for conversion, or but there are some really key things that he does recognize. One is falling down on the earth with a fear of your unworthiness, and the recognition of your unworthiness
Seeing
that
themselves in
gets.
their own carnal state.
Yes, absolutely. And that is exactly what's happening in early 19th century revival meetings. People are being convicted of their sins. They're falling down on the ground. They're feeling overwhelmed. And then the Spirit lets them understand that they have been, saved. And so they rejoice and they are filled with the Spirit. These are the same mechanisms that we see in King Benjamin's speech. So yes, okay, gosh, it would be great if we could find a covenant, ancient Hebrew covenant basis in there. But if I've got a more contemporary understanding of what's happening in that moment from a from a source that is happening around Joseph and from numerous sermons in the 19th century, then that seems to be a much more reasonable reason to have that in the Book of Mormon than that it's an ancient Hebrew form of covenant making. It absolutely tracks with early 19th century revival meetings.
And if I just give one last comment, because people want me to push back more and interject more in this conversation, I totally understand and grant that perspective. I could see an apologist saying that yes, it accounts for the conversion experiences, turning to Christ, sort of the bowing down, but it doesn't explain the sort of ancient connections scholars point to. And they might say that if you were to grant, for sake of argument, which might be a big grant, that the Nephites had Christianity and that revelation was given to them, then they could have had a similar sort of religious experience, but these ancient forms still being present because this is coming from an ancient text. And if this is just Joseph producing a 19th century revivalist sermon, it doesn't explain for all these things that wouldn't be part of that revival experience. The ancient covenant renewal, the Feast of Tabernacle similarities with the pitching of the tents, the coronation, the farewell speech. That's sort of my last point in this, and then we can move on.
Oh, look, I hope so. I guess I get, the three things are: is it causation? Is it correlation? Is it coincidence? Those are, we hope that there's, if we're going to try and prove anything, that we prove, causation. How do we do that? Well, there'd have to be a number of things that you would find. You'd have to find some other text, outside the biblical record that supports the idea that Christ's renewal is happening to 600 BC persons. You'd have to suggest that what's happening in revival meetings is more ancient.
So you're saying if we find in Mesoamerica an ancient covenant renewal to Christ, then you'll be like, okay, that might be compelling.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, that's right.
That might be a
And
game changer for Ganesh.
yeah, well, we yeah, the problem is dependence, right? And for at the moment, I can see King Benjamin's speech and sermon more dependent on what's happening to Joseph Smith in those revival meetings than what's happened, than something ancient. Like we have depictions of people pitching their tents to see people on platforms, you know, giving preaching in early 19th century America. This is well documented. So, you know, yeah, we'd have to find it so much more uniqueness. And
Yeah, okay. So you're kind of arguing it's not clearly or obviously a unique ancient element percent. I can sort of see both interpretations, shall we say. I can sort of grant, although I'm sort of diving into waters that I don't have expertise on,
yeah,
from
yeah, yeah.
how they're sort of showing the connections, I can see some of those ancient connections they're proposing to. I can certainly see the modern connections in it being a revival. And I think it's interesting to see the two different interpretations.
Yep.
Anything to add to
Um,
that, David, or should we move to the next question?
No, I agree with Richard Bushman entirely on this particular issue. I think it's part of the puzzle of the Book of Mormon. It's part of the enigma of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think we're ever going to really, get to total clarity on these issues. I spent a whole year um, going through the guy Donald Perry, who wrote the Book of Mormon, and he reformatted it into these poetic parallelisms with all of the chiasms and all of the other forms, literary forms. And I went through all of them for a whole year, and I found them immensely beautiful. But where do they come from? Are they ancient Hebrewisms, or are they, as Ganesh suggests, are they influenced from 19th century Joseph's 19th century milieu? I don't know.
Yeah, it can really be debated. Right, should we talk about ancient names next? Um, maybe we'll just talk about the first couple of questions first. We'll come to Mulek later. So this question's come from me, but faithful scholars have found certain names in the Book of Mormon are attested ancient Hebrew or Egyptian names. So they found names like Sariah or Alma in ancient sources, or like Pahanchi, Pakumeni, Bahorn, which is kind of interesting. First of all, I want to get your thoughts on just finding certain ancient names that are plausibly attested in antiquity. But I did an interview with Matt Bowen, who's a Bible scholar, and he's done lots of work on wordplays in the Book of Mormon. So not just looking at ancient names, but there being wordplays or puns in the text. So it's sort of the meaning of the name being found in the text, sort of adding this extra complexity. Probably the simplest one being Jershon being given as a land of inheritance for the anti-Nephi Lehi people. And in Hebrew, Jershon meaning, place of inheritance or to inherit. And someone would say, okay, you wouldn't know that from English, but actually, if you understood the underlying Hebrew or Egyptian, then, well, in this case, Hebrew, then the wordplay makes sense. And I find it interesting. Again, this is diving into things where I don't have the linguistic expertise to argue extensively. I want to read Matt Bowen's work, but I think it's interesting. What's your thoughts on ancient names in the Book of Mormon that have been found? Um, do you just view it as a coincidence? And your thoughts on wordplays and Matt Bowen's work?
um, uh, to me, I don't know enough to be able to comment so intellectually, but my initial understandings, and certainly I've looked at names in the Book of Mormon, the kind of things that give me problematic for me when it comes to the Book of Mormon are the names actually as a whole, for a number of reasons. One is that there are lots of names in the Book of Mormon, but they are used in often very small spaces, within a chapter or two of each other. And sometimes whoever's the author, which I suggest is is Joseph. He forgets the names, even though the um, the name has just been said a few, verses before. Um, a good example of that is Abish. Her name is forgotten, um, within a few sentences, which makes me think that Joseph is utilizing names in the text. Um, sometimes it goes, he may throw out a name, but then not remember it to be able to continue it on. There are obviously some names that get continued throughout the whole thing, some big names that he's able to construct. And there's a lot, but there are hundreds of names which are kind of thrown out as people, but then never either not be referred to again or be referred to within the same chapter or the adjacent chapter. The whole of the beginning of the Book of Mormon, the replacement text, is devoid of lots of names. The main characters are there, but there are some people that should be named that are not named at all, like Nephi's wife, Ishmael's
Yeah, it would
wife.
be good if she was
You know,
named.
the kings of Nephi are not named. These are supposed to be the and I think the best explanation why that replacement text does not have the amount of names that the rest of the text has is because if we're looking back at William Davis's work, this is an oral production, and Joseph remembers what he has said, but he can't always remember the details. And some of those names that he has put forward in the original, in the manuscript that's been lost, he can't remember, and so he's worried that the old manuscript is going to be brought forward. That's evident from the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon. There's a preface in there, and he can't remember. Did I call Nephi's wife, Abigail, or did I call her Anita? He can't quite remember, and so instead of pretending or fudging or getting it wrong, he just leaves it out. She's not there. She doesn't get named. Ishmael's wife doesn't get named. These the kings from Nephi, so none of Nephi's children get named. These are this is not in keeping with the rest of the text. The rest of the text describes particularly sons. They don't always talk about the women, but these people should be named. They're not. I think it's because you can't quite remember them, which is in keeping with the rest of them, from Mosiah onwards, where names are thrown out, then they become somewhat fodder. They're not referred to again. Sometimes they're missed and not actually referred to. So, yeah, the names thing is really interesting to me. Lots of the names are derivatives of already put out names. They're add-ons. There's just lists and lists of them. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
Did
I've
Joseph
got.
have a yeah?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
Joseph,
finish your thought.
question. Oh, I was just going to say that did Joseph have a list of names that might have had some Hebrew antiquity? I think that if we agree that Adam Clarke's commentary was being used by Joseph, Adam Clarke's commentary has a number of Hebrew names, and maybe he lifted some of that. There, the names present lots of problems in the Book of Mormon, more problems than than aha moments.
Okay, I've got two thoughts going through my mind. I hope I don't forget them. So the first one was because so the first argument you made was about Abish, and then she's mentioned, but then she's not mentioned. I remember hearing another example given. It might have been the LDS discussion series about Nehor, who slays Gideon. And actually, I remember whenever I read it in the Book of Mormon. So it happens in chapter 1 when Nehor slays Gideon, and then in chapter 2 it says. for a certain man being called Amaleki, being a very cunning man, he being after the order of the man that slew Gideon. So it doesn't mention the name Nehor, and I think it was Mike mentioned that, oh, that's because he forgot his name. But then at the same time, I remember reading later in the chapter that Nehor's name is mentioned again. Now, I suppose you could maybe say with that theory that he forgot it temporarily and then he mentioned it again. But that was an example of, oh, even though his name was omitted in verse 1, it was later mentioned later on. So that'll be like one counterpoint. And then the other response I would give to that is that, Joseph couldn't remember names. So, for example, that's why all the kings were named Nephi, because he couldn't remember from the last 116 pages. But then whenever I proposed the argument about like the 30 Jaredite kings being outlined in Ether 1 and then all 30 being referred to in reverse order, that's kind of a complex feature. Now, obviously, William Davis has shown it's not humanly impossible, but that would point to Joseph Smith having a good memory when it came to names because he was able to remember that. So that's me maybe just pushing back in that argument. And when it comes to the ancient names in the Book of Mormon, and Adam Clarke's commentary, I've interviewed Kent Jackson, and he sort of has criticized the Adam Clarke commentary connection, but again, I'll sort of bracket that for the moment. But it'd be interesting to look if any of these ancient names that have been found are from Adam Clarke's commentary. But let's just say if there's none, and there's been, 15 or so attested, do you still not find that convincing, or do you just view it as maybe Joseph's just saying names and it's just coincidences?
There is some form of pattern. Like Joseph employs a pattern with the names, or at least, sorry, even if we're not suggesting that it's Joseph, if we're just saying there are patterns for the names in the Book of Mormon, there are abbreviations. Like for instance, we've got Moroni, and then we've got Moroni Ha, right? We've got Ammon and Ammoni Ha. Like
I made a joke with my friends once. My friend was gonna have a baby, and he was like, "What should I call it?" And I was like, "Just add a ha on the end."
Yeah,
Kyle
right.
Ha.
Kyle Ha. So there's there again, and we've talked about this in our last episode too. There are complexities in the Book of Mormon. Like there is definitely crafting from I can see there's crafting, but there's also sometimes where it's quite clunky. So does that show sophistication? Does that just show that sometimes you're on and it flows really well and it seems really great, and other times it's a little bit less than beautiful, right? So it's going to your point, David, about the poetic forms of the Book of Mormon. Yes, they're absolutely there. There's some times where you read it and it's just so poetic, and I get it. I find that incredibly emotive. There's also parts of the Book of Mormon that are so clunky. Like you read it and you're like, what? Why would anybody write it like that? It's just all over the place. So and to me that looks like somebody who has on days and has off days. People could say that about my writing. One day it flows like I'm a literary genius, and then other days it makes me look like I have a stutter.
So, I know you say you've not dived super deeply into this, and again, this is something I don't have much expertise in, but your thoughts on the name, but with like the wordplay. So, like Jershon's the most common one, or where they pointed to, Nephi, a similar word in Egyptian, I think Nephir, some of the meaning of it being like good and fair, and we see, Nephi's goodness, or the Nephi's being referred to as like, oh, ye fair ones being referred to. Like if you find those sort of if you accepted the wordplay, would you find that compelling? Like, okay, it's not just a name, it's a wordplay. Maybe this could be an argument for ancient antiquity going beyond what Joseph could have known. Just any thoughts on that?
So Nephi is in the Apocrypha, so it's actually a biblical name.
Yes, that's right.
It's just not in the Protestant Bible, but it was certainly in the King James version of 19th century. So the ideas of good and fair, I don't know. I think that you'd have to find so many that those would be significant, right? If you found five names that had, you know, some kind of interplay or meaning in its name, and that seemed to be, I think that you could absolutely argue that it was a coincidence. If you find 100 um, names that have, you know, significant meaning, I think that then you'd have something significant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes
So
sense. I think I don't know the precise number. I think I asked Matt Bowen. I can't I can't remember what he said. I think it was probably certainly more than a dozen, if not dozens. He feels that he's
yeah,
found some being stronger, some less. But I think at least his scholarship. I can send you the interview we did, and I think his books and his scholarship. I at least find it interesting. That's at least something where I'm like, I need to look into that. That's interesting. Um, so anyway, we can move on from that. I want to bring up your thoughts on Mulek. This is one that I think is probably one of the most compelling when it comes to ancient names that I find interesting. So Mulek is a character in the Book of Mormon, you know, son of Zedekiah. In the King James Bible, it says Malchiah, who is son of Hamelech, which is the Hebrew translation for son of the king. So it's not actually clearly in the King James Bible that he's son of King Zedekiah, because I don't think Joseph would have known what Hamelech meant, or maybe he did. Maybe if he could have glossed from a Bible commentary. But Mulek being a plausible Hebrew sort of shortened variant from Malchiah. And then a stamp seal was found in the 1980s, archaeologically saying that Malchiah is son of the king, which was Zedekiah. And the stamp seal dates to the 6th century. And the argument is that Mulek is really a very plausible shortened Hebrew variant of Malchiah, who is attested to be a son of King Zedekiah. And the MLK root still works in Mulek. Obviously, there's not vowels in these ancient languages. And I find that one like really interesting, compelling, the odds of Joseph guessing that. And I actually have a quote from a non-Bible scholar who was asked about this. Let me just find this. Yeah, a non-Mormon Bible scholar, David Noel Friedman, reportedly exclaimed when he was presented the argument of Mulek, if Joseph Smith came up with that one, he did pretty good. I don't think he converted to Mormonism, but that's one where I'm like, that's pretty interesting. That's kind of compelling. What's your thoughts on Mulek, and why aren't you convinced?
gosh, I like it. Um,
I like it
I,
too.
yeah, yeah. How can I my question for myself, if I'm looking at that, how can I suggest a difference between, you know, coincidence, correlation, and causation?
Hmm.
Try not to cough while we're talking. Um, the Yeah, like I'd like to see more on that to determine, and you know, it just you know, the problem with MLK, the problem with you know, Nahum, NHM, you know, those kinds of things, is that we're talking about Hebrew vowels, words. Are they the same? Are they different? That requires a level of sophistication that you know, I'm not qualified on, but I would, you know, those are the kinds of things I really like Dan McClellan to
I
weigh
was
in
just
on,
thinking that.
because
Well, this is
yeah,
another thing we should send to Dan McClellan just to get. I'd be interested to get what's his thoughts on this as well, and you know if it can be debunked or undermined. You know, I'd like to see it. I actually appreciate you saying that. I think it's important to acknowledge where you know we don't have expertise in this or to do more research on. I appreciate you acknowledging that because I have to acknowledge that when it comes to certain critical
yeah.
arguments as well.
Yeah, look, it's not my area of expertise. Like, whenever I'm evaluating anything, I think, is it available in Joseph Smith's life? You know, like, is it in his environment? You know, that seems to be as a more plausible explanation. Well, at least I have to investigate that first, as opposed to a ancient one. Um, if it's not there and it is in the ancient one, well, then it's something that's compelling, and we should look at it.
So if you were to find when it comes to Mulek, you can't find a modern source or something in his environment, and if you look at the scholarship and it seems like yeah, this is a plausible Hebrew shortened variant for the name, and you know it the stamp seal dates to the 6th century BCE. Mulek seems like a plausible shortened name for Malkiahu. Would you at least, even though that wouldn't cause to believe, could you understand why somebody might find that compelling, and maybe yourself might be like, oh, that's something that's interesting because, I sort of think of it, the odds of him picking the name Mulek and that being a plausible Hebrew shortened variant for Malkiahu, who is attested as the son of King Zedekiah. I kind of see that as a bit of a hit. I wouldn't go as far as a bullseye, but that's an interesting hit.
I think it's worth investigation. Uh, guess to me, the biggest thing, you know, that my trickiness is, okay, let's suggest this is a hit, but it's
Maybe I'll not
very
say
specific.
100% definitive hit.
Okay,
I'll maybe I won't go that far, but it seems to correlate and be very, very plausible.
so my question, the thing that I'd be asking myself is, why is something so specific a hit when something so huge like the text of Isaiah in you know Second Nephi, why can't that be a hit?
Mm.
Because that the fact that Second Nephi Isaiah is dependent on the King James Version of the Bible, that's really big. The idea that this really specific thing, and it's kind of slightly tiny, is a hit. That's when we're talking scale. I love it, but if I'm yeah, the two things are on completely different
So you're
scales.
saying if you have scales, the heavy second Isaiah King James Bible that tips the scale than the teeny little Mulek. Even though I think
Yeah.
Mulek's an interesting fact. Okay, well let's move on to and feel free, David, if you want to interject at any time, to Hebraisms and Chiasmus. And I'll just say from the get-go, I don't argue that I don't find Hebraisms themselves a strong argument for an ancient Book of Mormon. I think many Hebraisms like Rod of Iron or I've Dreamed a Dream or the usage of and it came to pass or like lists of like and nor. I think a lot of that could have been Joseph imitating from the King James Bible. So obviously if you believe the Book of Mormon's a translation of the ancient text, then you might still believe, oh, that's some of it coming through. But I wouldn't use that as an argument to say, this is strong evidence for ancient origin. The one I'm most curious in your thoughts on is the if and conditionals, which I believe some of those made its way through in the original manuscript, but were later revised, which doesn't make much grammatical sense in English. But in Hebrew, they would say, if you do this and this. And how do you make sense of that? Because believers who would see it as a translation of an ancient text might see it as maybe the Hebrew is just sort of coming through sometimes in the translation, whereas would if and conditionals been part of Joseph Smith's vernacular or vocabulary?
Yeah, again, it's not my expertise, so I can't say. I did. One of your commenters made the point that uh, actually it could have been a dictation thing where Oliver heard and when Joseph pronounced then, like the way that Joseph's accent may have given it a sounding of and when he was actually saying then, which I thought was kind of quite an interesting
I've not heard that
take
one.
on
I'd
that.
have to think about that because I don't think and then sound super similar to me, but there definitely is mishearing, mistakes in the original manuscript, but I don't know about that one. I guess it
Yeah.
depends how he says it.
Like for me, when I'm looking at these Hebraisms, well, chiasm's a really interesting one for me, and I've got an example I can kind of show for you.
Sure.
I'll just put up a new. Um, I'm going to share my screen here and then show you this. So here is when I'm looking at the text of the Book of Mormon. This is something I think is incredibly compelling when you're thinking about uh, crafting. We've talked about this in the last podcast, but the idea that there is definitely crafting going on. The stories in the Book of Mormon, certainly we've got great evidence that they are intentional. And the biggest find I've found in this regard is Mosiah 9 and 10. So this is this is the story of Zenith. These are the two chapters in the current Book of Mormon that is the story of Zenith. Now, this is in the original Book of Mormon, this is one chapter, but it's been split into two in our current Book of Mormons. And so I've put Mosiah 9 next to Mosiah 10, and we can see something really interesting, and that is that Mosiah 9 and Mosiah 10 are the same story arc with the same kinds of intentionality, the same kinds of phrases in the same order. So for those who are listening, you might not be able to see this, and I think it's worthwhile jumping on to visualize this. But
yeah,
I put them side by side so you can see them. So the passages in yellow show almost exact wording. The passages in greens show a very similar intention, but a different wording. And the passages in blue show. Whoops, sorry. Just zoom that right out. Show some really interesting correlations. So this text 9 and 10, when you line them up against each other, you see that there are like
similar wording, similar themes.
Cues. Yeah, and we get down to verse 9 in chapter 9 and 5 in chapter 10, where we also have an example of 6 things. It's a list of 6 things in both chapters in the same sequence. They're different things in this particular case, but as you go down, you'll see that this is all in the same order, and then you get to the later in the chapters, and you find verse 16 in chapter 9 and verse 8 in chapter 10, another list of 6, which are almost identical in both chapters. So we have this really interesting, side by side in these two chapters, where you can see that the text of the two chapters are dependent on a kind of a script, and there are very, very close associations for the types of language that are being produced in both. This is what I think is an example of how the Book of Mormon, parts of the Book of Mormon at least, are being constructed, and that is there's a memorization of points, often with phrases attached to them. So those phrases are being repeated in both accounts in the same order with the same kind of effect. And they tell a slightly different story. So when you're reading them, you don't actually notice that they're the same. But when you do the analysis, you can see that they're the same.
They're similar sort of parallel narratives. And I know you talk about that in your book. There's parallel narratives, and actually Grant Hardy as well. I don't know if you've read his book, Understand the Book of Mormon. I thought it was a really great book, and he talks about that. Whether or not really you want to view this as Joseph, who is the author, just sort of repeating himself with the stories, or you want to view it as Mormon making sort of like theological point with these repeated storylines, shall we say. That's something clear, is that there's some parallel narratives, like with Ammon and Aaron, for example, is another example of it.
Yes. So okay. So yeah. Okay. So let's exactly. So let's talk about that. So these two chapters side by side suggest that it's actually the same. Like if you were going to memorize a story and have definite points along the way that you want to hit, then you memorize the phrases, let's say the points, and then you repeat them in the same order. And that's exactly what we see in Mosiah 9 and Mosiah 10. When you read this, of course, it doesn't feel the same. And there's a good reason for that, is that Joseph goes off on a tangent in both of those chapters in a different place. And the tangent is a Lamanite explanation. Why are the Lamanites, doing this against Zeniff and his people? Well, they're two different Lamanite. They're both Lamanite explanations, but they're different Lamanite explanations, and they feature in a different place in the text. So the idea that whoever is crafting this, and if it's an oral production like William Davis suggests, they've got their narrative outline, they've got points that they're going to hit, but in the midst of dictation, they go off on a tangent somewhere around the text, but they were able to come back to the exact same point because they've got a memorization of where they are and continue in the same text. And because those two, both the Lamanite they're both Lamanite explanations, but they're different and they appear in different places in the text. Those two chapters feel different. So when you read them, and they're side by side, so you've got a feeling there that's confirmed, but they're actually they feel different. They read differently, so you don't see that they're actually the same narrative structure. And you're right to point out. So this happens in the Book of Mormon lots of times, and I'll show you a couple of examples. So these repeated stories happen in King Noah in Mosiah, and Replicash, which is in Ether. Mosiah chapter 11 and Replicash, Ether chapter 10. So these two kings, King Noah and King Replicash. So I've put at the top, they're slightly different lengths, same progression, same events, same wording. The progression is righteous father, son did not keep the commandments, wives and concubines, heavy taxes, built spacious buildings, fine throne, fine workmanship, afflict the people, people rebelled against him, killed, and the supporters driven out. And that is the same narrative arc in both understandings. Now, this is not Mormon here because Mosiah is in the portion that is abridged by Mormon, but Ether is in the portion that's abridged by Moroni.
Yeah.
So, but these narrative arcs are in both are the same. There's a big gap between this, of course, because Mosiah has done it in March of 1829, and Ether is done in June of 1829. So there's a time difference between these two, but which I suggest also helps with the idea that when this narrative arc is used again, and I'm saying this is Joseph who's using it again, he's time has passed, and so the narrative arcs are more distant in their comparison, but you can still see them, and I've detailed them right next to each other and with the same in the same ideas in the same order with the same conclusion again. And that happens for this example. We also see this with Sherem and Korihor. So Sherem is in Jacob chapter 7, which is in the Nephi portion, and Korihor, which is Alma chapter 30, which is in the Mormon portion or Mormon abridgment.
Yeah, Jacob's part of the small plates.
Correct. So this is also the case. So these accounts, although they're different lengths, right? Because again, Alma 30 is done probably in April of 1829, and Jacob 7 is done in June of 1829. So, but we have the same thing happening. So we've got the same narrative arcs. We've got Antichrist preaches, leads away hearts, converses with a high priest, denies prophecy, gets refuted, appeals to the Holy Spirit, asks for a sign, warned not to tempt God, struck down, confesses deception, dies badly, and people are converted. And so the same lesson, same narrative arc, but also if you look at the text, you see that there's the same phrasing, the same wording that is a correlation. So people can look at that as they go through.
I would like to go through these again myself.
Yeah.
So I guess you would say that you would see these as similar sort of narrative points and similar phrases that you would view Joseph as the author is repeating. And this is across different parts of the Book of Mormon that would have different editors according to the Book of Mormon text. And I was just looking up quickly because the Book of Mormon can be quite repetitive, and that's a criticism of it. But one sort of apologetic pushback, someone could say, is actually ancient Hebrew authors were quite repetitive in their writing. That was almost like an intentional feature of their literary style, and even across the Book of Mormon, wanting to emphasize or almost repeat certain narratives as being like an aid to memory, to emphasize important things, and also part of like the literary art. So even some things that we see as like redundant or not good writing, very repetitious, somebody could say, well, maybe this is just part of the translation and the ancient Hebrew authors writing. What would be your quick response to that?
Well, the trickinesses of these examples, right, is these are English phrases. These are, you'd think that if this was being like this is the Book of Mormon is supposed to be 1,000-year time frame, or in fact, if you include the Jaredite record with
even
it,
more.
which is Ether, we're talking about 3,000 years, effectively between 2.5 to 3,000 years. So, the idea that um, if this is a history, something ancient, then you would expect that two different places in the text would be quite different. That's one of the things that I think that Dan Vogel would bring up, is that one of his big points about biblical criticism is that the Bible is not univocal. That different parts of the Bible are written by different people in different time frames, so they are reflective of their particular time frame, and therefore, that's why you get lots of different variations. I mean, Protestant Christians want to have it be univocal and speak for God in one particular way, but you can't, because they're actually different people in different time frames. But the opposite is true of the Book of Mormon. We've got this example of Riplikesh in Ether, and this example of Noah in Mosiah, and they're reading the same way with the same narrative arc, with the same. So it suggests a univocal author, the same author.
Well, what if someone were to say, because you sort of make the argument in your book and sort of in our past conversation that in certain books of the Book of Mormon, there's almost seems to be some theological evolution. And what if somebody were to say, like, well, that might almost make sense if there's different authors writing, as you said, like Dan McClellan would make that argument when it comes to the Bible not being univocal, but I think you would argue when it comes to maybe certain doctrine, particularly with like baptism, it's not univocal or completely consistent. But someone might say, like, well, could not be used to support there being different authors in the Book of Mormon? Because if it was Joseph was the author, then everything would be completely harmonious and univocal. What do you say to that?
Well, there's two things going on there. One is that there's lots of univocal stuff, right? The same phrases are being used by Nephi as they're being used by Mormon, which and throughout, which suggests that there's a univocal voice. The same issues that Nephi has, Mormons having. But also the idea, if you the problem with that, of course, is the Mosiah priority, and that is that the evolution in the text is along the dictation sequence, which one of the really good examples. I mean, we talked about the idea of anti-Catholic material entering the text when Joseph and Oliver moved to the Fayette farm, and so you see it in the last part of the Mormon and also the first part, because those parts are dictated in Fayette. That is also true of types of narrative. So when you start in Mosiah, you see first-person narrative, like you do with Zeniff's account in Mosiah chapter 9 and 10, and you see a third-person account, which is effectively a narrator talking about what's going on. And we learn by 3rd Nephi chapter 5 that narrator is Mormon.
Right.
So that's what you see in the text. When when the text changes to Fayette, um, we see a new linguistic narrative, and that is second person narrative. So where the author addresses the audience. So we see that in Mormon, we see that in Moroni, we also see it in Nephi, and we see it in Jacob, where the author addresses the reader. And this only happens once the Oliver and Joseph get to Fayette. This is only second person narrative only happens in Fayette in the dictation sequence. So the yes, there is development, and I would suggest that that's because Joseph has learned a new narrative style, and he's now employing it prodigiously from that point on, because he finds it persuasive. The idea of the author addressing the reader is a very persuasive, a form of literary device. And now that he's discovered it, he's now producing it for Mormon, Moroni, Nephi, Jacob. There's not something that happens.
I've actually not noticed that. I'll have to look into that, because some people might say, oh, well, doesn't First Nephi begin with sort of like first person, like, oh, I, Nephi, have been born of goodly parents? But you're saying later it changes.
No, it does have first person. It absolutely has first person. And it has some third person in there too. But it also has second person narrative. But second person narrative does not enter the text of the Book of Mormon in the dictation sequence till Fayette. Something's happened. When he's gone to Fayette, something has changed. And the writers, the characters in the Book of Mormon address the audience. Mormon addresses the audience. Moroni addresses the audience. Nephi addresses the audience, and Jacob addresses the audience. Alma doesn't address the audience. King Mosiah doesn't address the audience. Nephi and third Nephi doesn't address the audience. That literary feature of persuasion, and even the word persuade, doesn't come up in the text till the Fayette portion. So, so these are kind of these are tells. These are for somebody who's looking at the text. For me, they're tells that something has changed, and because it's in the dictation sequence, and it's related to a location, that tells me that it's due to Joseph. Joseph. Why would Joseph's location determine the text of the Book of Mormon? Well, because he's progressing as this work is going on. There's some things he's keeping, like he's still doing the first person narrative, still doing the third person narrative. He's now included the second person narrative.
Okay, that's an interesting observation. I'll need to look into that. I think that's very noteworthy, and that's one I'm not super familiar with, and actually find quite interesting. I'm thinking that maybe we should wrap up maybe on this chiasmus section.
Okay.
And then, because we could end up, I'm actually loving this, but I'm thinking like, oh, it's like 9 o'clock my time. My wife's probably wondering, where am I on a Friday night? This is my idea of a good time on a Friday night. But maybe we could wrap up on the literary forms and chiasmus, and we'll do a part 3. So I guess the question that I want to ask you when it comes to chiasms, so you're sort of already addressing that you see some of this as repetition, and I personally don't see chiasmus itself as evidence of this being an ancient feature necessarily. There's chiasmus in the Bible. There's even some chiasmus in the Doctrine and Covenants, and like the chiasmus where Jesus is like, whosoever will save his life will lose it, and whosoever will lose his life will find it, for my sake. Or I know I totally butchered that verse, but those aren't very like persuasive or impressive chiasmus. I think the ones that I find most interesting, and as David alluded to, very poetic, is like Alma 36, which is a very long, complex, and I think a beautiful chiasmus. And people might argue that how do you believe that Joseph was able to orally dictate a chiasmus like that? It just seems to be so beautifully formed and structured, and you can understand maybe an ancient author who's trained in chiasmus, but just being able to orally dictate that himself with his natural ability seems very impressive. And then I'm also curious your thoughts on, I'll bring up Helaman 6 after, but your thoughts on the long, complex chiasmus. That just adds to the complexity of how was Joseph able to orally dictate some of those really complex ones, and why not side with this is coming from an ancient author rather than Joseph Smith's oral capabilities?
Okay, cool. Um, I'll just go back for 1 second, just to you brought up before the parallel stories of Ammon and Aaron, right? Which is
Oh,
Alma
yes, I
chapter
mentioned that. Oh, sorry. Yes,
yeah,
mentioned that.
Alma chapter 17 and Alma chapter 22. So these are only these the when we're talking about Mosiah chapter 9, chapter 10, right? They're right next to each other. They probably were dictated either the same day or adjacent days. Alma chapter 17 and Alma chapter 22, they're close by, but they're not next to each other, so they're probably dictated a couple of days apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
So just to finish off that bit about these things here, and I'll answer your question. So
No problem. No problem.
Ammon's mission and Aaron's mission, again, the stories are slightly different, but they're the same points in the same order with the exact same wording. And I've identified 20 parallels between the two. And there, if people can want to read that. And then I'll just go down so that people can read it and see them side by side. And you can see that the two accounts are relating the same information, sometimes exactly the same wording, in the same order, with the same results. So this is another example of those that incredible parallelisms, right? Or incredible parallel between the two accounts.
Yes.
So I've shown that these are in different parts of the Book of Mormon. So in the Mormon part, the Moroni part, and the Nephi part, and that these particular examples transverse those. But if we go back to the version of Mosiah 9 and Mosiah 10, and remember that this in the original Book of Mormon, the 1830 version of Book of Mormon, this is the same chapter. This is not two chapters. We've got them in we've split them up later, but this is the same chapter. And as you go through the example, you can see that there are multiple correlations between the two. So much so that I've identified 31. Let's see down the bottom here. 31 direct comparisons. So effectively, if what I'm saying is correct, I'm saying that Joseph has memorized 30 plus ideas in a particular sequence, and then he's repeated those 30 plus ideas again. So 1 to 30, and then 1 to 30 again. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Or 31, 32, or whatever it is. So, but if he had repeated the second group backwards, you would have a chiasmus. So all I'm saying is that Joseph had, whoever has composed Mosiah 9 and Mosiah 10, because they've definitely crafted it, if they just repeated the sequence backwards in the second account, you would have a giant chiasmus. And so I'm saying that this is a literary skill, the ability to memorize and then to dictate these things. And if he does it forwards twice, he's got these two stories side by side. If he does it forward once and then second, he does it backwards, he's got a chiasmus.
And in your theory, Do you believe Joseph would have picked up, because obviously chiasmus wasn't really discovered or known in Joseph's time, but do you think he would have, as the author, consciously, or do you think this is a subconscious thing from the Bible putting chiasmus in the text?
I don't know that. I think that he probably, you know, I don't think chiasmus is too sophisticated. Like it's just a way of telling a story. It's just a different way of telling a story, right? In Mosiah 9 and 10, you can tell the same story twice and get two different stories, side by side, and they complement each other. I think that I think just to mix it up, maybe could have been he's just mixing it up. It could have been that he recognizes that actually and we all do it to some degree, right? We tell a story a particular way, and then to re-emphasize the story, we tell it backwards. Like this is just generally the way we try and make sense of our world with stories. And he could have discovered that by accident. It could have been something that was pointed out to him. He could have recognized it as a literary device that he is, that's currently in the King James version that he picks up on. I think that it's just the way that we tell stories, and the fact that if you memorize something and you memorize it so well that you can recite it forwards or you can recite it backwards, and you did this with William Davis, right? You did it with the kings of Ether, by reciting them forwards and then reciting them backwards. So, that
I'm
creates
still
a
adamant he
chiasmus.
peaked somehow. No, I'm just kidding.
Right?
I'm still adamant he peaked somehow. He had them on his
But
wall.
he had them on as well. Oh, yeah.
On
Well,
the inside of what was it, a tie put around his face? They were on the inside or something. No, I'm just kidding.
but so if you're, and I look, you've got to understand that Joseph's world, and William Davis talks about this too, right? That he's very poor, so paper and ink are at a premium. It just and people around him are poor, so lots of the education and the ideas of retaining information came from being able to memorize stuff, to keep lists in your head, because you're not necessarily going to write a grocery list and then be able to. You're going to have to remember that when you get to the store or you get to the place that you're going to. You're going to have to memorize these things. And so you're going to have to know them forwards, and you're going to have to know them backwards, and you're going to have to recite them in various ways. I think that's just a feature of his 19th century environment where he's poor, and this is just the way that people do things. I mean, we just don't need to do that now. We've got a computer. I can write these things down. I can put them right next to each other. But if you're going to retain any information, you're going to have to do it with memorization. That's just the reality. So these
Okay, and you would sort of see it, for example, with Alma 36 or the long complex chiasmus, that he would have had these narrative elements or points in his mind, and that he's laying them down in one order and he's able to repeat it in the opposite order if he has them somewhat memorized, at least the points.
because that's exactly what we see in Mosiah 9 and 10, right? These they read differently, but they hit the same points in the same order, uh, in the same locations. Like it's brilliant. It's this is exactly what's happening here. These are not small things, and we know that he's not looking at anything. He's memorizing. He's got a list, and he's memorizing a list within a list, because we've got these six things um, in verse 16 and 8, and then we've got another six things, and you know later on in the chapters. Yeah. So there's two sets of six things, is what I'm saying.
I
Um,
gotcha. No, I'd really love to bring on a faithful scholar, maybe Brent Gardner, and to actually discuss these things you've shown, because I think this is really well laid out. I like the visuals as well, and I think that's something to be addressed. I know Grant Hardy sort of addresses some of this. I don't know if it's the same chapters in his book about parallel narratives, but really his book is sort of setting aside historicity, whether or not you want to believe it's an ancient or Joseph is the author. But I think that's really interesting. Can I ask you one last question on chiasmus before
Yeah,
we
sure,
sort of
sure.
wrap up, just to finish on this point? Actually, the chiasm that I find the most intriguing, and the one that, like, if I were talking to a critic, this is the one that I would actually want to bring up, is what I think is actually one of the most compelling ones. It's quite a long one. It's in Helaman 6. It's not as long as Alma 36, but it's about 17 verses. Um, and at the very center of the chiasm is Zedekiah and Lord, which you think like
Yeah.
doesn't really work, like Zedekiah and Lord. But something that I found interesting was, and I'm getting this from Scripture Central. I did look this up, and the suffix of Zedekiah, kiah, actually means Lord in Hebrew. So they would say that this chiasm doesn't actually fully work in English, but actually it would have worked in Hebrew. And if you believe that there could have been underlying Egyptian and Hebrew, then this chiasm works in the ancient language. And I thought that was really interesting. It's not just a long chiasmus, accounting for Joseph's abilities to, orally dictate it, which you feel like he could have done that. But it's like, wow, how do you explain the Lord, Zedekiah and kiah meaning Lord in Hebrew? That's at least, similar to Mulek, kind of, that's an interesting connection at least. Are you aware of that? What are your thoughts on it? Yeah.
Like I think that's, well, for me, that's within Joseph's ability, and maybe even within his ability to improvise. Like when I look at Mosiah chapter 9 versus Mosiah chapter 10, I mean it's quite sophisticated. Like it's really clever.
Mhm.
Um, and it plays on some really interesting ideas. It's written in first person, so it's written as if Zenith is actually saying this. Not that Mormon is abridging it. Um, it's he, it's very cleverly laid out. It's obviously got the structure is in the background is just so um, you know sophisticated in terms of it's hitting those points in those orders, but also when you look around the text, he's actually free forming it like it's well, maybe I'll share it again just so you can see what I'm talking
Yeah, yeah.
about. Um, uh, so here, like uh, if you see at the beginning, right, the land that we might possess it, began to possess land. So there's his anchor is there, and then he's using a different framing, but they're the same kinds of concepts. So we begin to build buildings and to repair the walls of the city, yea, even to the walls of the city of Nephi Lehi, and in the same space in the additional text, he's saying, I cause that there should be weapons of war made of every kind, that thereby I might have weapons for my people. So there's a sense of a project. The idea that in the first instance, it's a project of building the city. And in the second instance, it's a project of building the army for defense. The walls are for defense, the armies for defense, and they're similar building projects in the same space. And then he's able to riff up on there, why he's doing it. Well, he's doing the weapons of war because he's making sure that people are going to be protected, right? Um, so there's a whole section of text in the second instance that there isn't in the first instance, because the next narrative anchor, the next memorized point is, and we began to till the ground. And that's repeated in the second instance. And I did cause that men should till the ground and raise all manner of grain. And on the other side, it's all manner of seed. And then he's got his list. So the this is really clever. Like it's incredibly, if you're going to, because you can imagine Joseph is doing this while he is he's orally dictating this. So he's hitting these points, but then he's able to flesh out the points in real time while still hitting his points to the next part of the narrative. Um, I find it just so beautiful. And then he's got his list. It's in the same place, and these are two different lists. But but it ends with the idea, we did begin and multiply and prosper the land in the first instance, and thus we did prosper in the land in the second instance. Like that's his narrative anchor, the next memorization point. And then in one instance he goes off on a tangent, and in the other instance he doesn't. So, but he does further on down the narrative. So the tangents are in different places, but he's able to take the tangent and come back to the exact same point. This is really clever composition. And he's doing it orally. So this is incredible in terms of its complexity, I think. Like we talked about this a little bit before last time when we were talking. I do comedy, which means that I have scripts in my head, but when I get up in front of an audience, what comes out of my mouth it's partly what I've memorized, it's partly what I'm riffing, it's partly a tangent I might go out on because I can see that the audience is really interested in what I'm saying, or I can get another joke here or another idea and fit it in the moment, and then come back to my point, come back to my joke, come back to my sequence, so that I can deliver in the right kind of way. So this is what all comedy is. That you could see that easily if you study the way that comics do it, but it's just performance in general. But Joseph is doing this. This is crafting. This is improvisation. This is tangents. This is riffing. This is filling in gaps. These are really clever ways to tell stories, and they're incredibly sophisticated, and they're obviously really effective because they build such great stuff. So yeah, if he can do that in Mosiah 9 and 10, he can absolutely do Alma 36. He can absolutely do Helaman. It's just this is good stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely complex. Maybe if I just quickly share my screen and actually show you that chiasm I just mentioned. Can you see that? You see my screen?
Yep, got it.
Yeah. Let's see. I'll try and make this a little bit bigger. Just to just re-emphasize the point. So we see at the very center where it says, "After the son of Zedekiah, for the Lord did bring Mulek." So you have Lord and Zedekiah. The point I made that I find interesting because I understand your point that Joseph was just able to orally dictate. He had this great memory, had all the points laid out in one order and then the other order. The thing that I find difficult to explain from Joseph's ability is even if he could have, just orally dictated chiasmus, this one having Zedekiah and Lord at the center and the suffix of kiah meaning Lord in Hebrew, and that being an argument to this isn't just a complex chiasmus, but faithful scholars or apologists would argue this is maybe the Hebrew making its way through, or it wouldn't work, I suppose, in English, but it does in Hebrew in the original language, so it would actually fit as a chiasm. Any thoughts of that? Like, I suppose you don't find that compelling that this is therefore an ancient underlying Hebrew or Egyptian script. But I find that an interesting chiasm. It's not just complex, but it's like it's strange that Joseph would have both Lord and Zedekiah at the center, and the suffix means Lord in Hebrew. What do you make of that?
Look, it seems clever, absolutely, and I like it. I guess I see that well within the scope of Mosiah chapter 9 and Mosiah chapter 10. I think Mosiah chapter 9, chapter 10 is a more complex version than even this.
Sure. I guess the argument would be that Joseph wouldn't know that the suffix of Zedekiah means Lord in Hebrew. I guess that would be the argument. But ancient Nephite authors who knew Egyptian and Hebrew would have, but then it doesn't come through in the English translation. But whenever they look at what Zedekiah means, it actually means the suffix means Lord, I guess is the point.
Yeah, I would. my only concern with that is that, you know, the only reason that Mosiah 9 and 10 work, and the only reason that this here works, is because lots of it is in English. So, you know, the where is he getting the words from? Are we saying that
Are you quoting Brian
there's
Hills?
yeah, yeah. Well, we'll talk. Well, that's our
We'll talk
kind
about
of
him
next
next
point
time.
to next time. But it suggests that, okay, well, there's this incredible interplay that's happening between Hebrew and English that is outside of Joseph's scope. But the challenge is that we have the Book of Mormon in English. We don't have it in Hebrew, so we can't tell if the chiasm would work in Hebrew. We had these little snippets where it seems to work, like Zedekiah and Lord. Um,
Do you know, these think it's quite interesting. Like it's like, oh,
oh
okay,
yeah, like
it gives Paul like
again,
that's cool. It's cool at least.
I think it's cool. I think it's absolutely cool. Um, so I'm impressed. If if if
And you can
Joseph
maybe
had done
see
that,
why a believer might, even if you're not persuaded by it, why a believer might say like, oh, like this isn't just a complex chiasmus, but this could point to there being underlying, ancient Hebrew or,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Oh, that would be cool. That would be so cool. I'd love to see more examples. I guess that's what lots of people have trying to say with the Hebraisms, the chiasm, those kinds of things.
we
That
just need
there's
to find more of this, and then we'll be make you a believer again.
well, 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 yes, but I also would love somebody to point out how come, you know, these we're getting these same story arcs, because I see them as the same. I see chiasm and what we're seeing in Mosiah 9 and 10, or in the account of Ammon and Aaron, or the account of Noah and Replicash, or the account of Sherem and Korihor. And there are many others too. This is not, I just giving you the kind of the highlights. Um, how is it that these repeated things are being done? I mean, 9 and 10, it's just it's just it's just a chiasm, but just done two different accounts in the same. But the fact that you can split these up from uh, you know from Korihor, like when you've got it in in Alma, and then you've got Sherem and Jacob. These are two different periods of the Book of Mormon dictation sequence. These are two different periods of time frame. These are two different um, narrative accounts. Supposed to be Nephi and Mormon. These things. How do we account for that? Because effectively, I'm showing you chiasms, chiasms that are happening, um, where the break between them suggests that the person doing them is the same person, and yeah, that can't be the case if it's Mormon and also Nephi, or Ether and also Mormon, or sorry, Moroni and also Mormon. That suggests that it's the person who's dictating, which we know is the same, who is Joseph. So,
Well, I'll have to bring a faithful scholar on to address that argument, but I think it's a good argument that you made, and I just
yeah,
want to say that I've really enjoyed this discussion. David, do you have
yeah, yeah.
any comments, and maybe Ganesh, any final comments just on this conversation? We're gonna have to do a next part to address the other topics. I think I could probably go all night, but my wife would not be happy with me. But
But
do you
yeah,
have
let's
any
finish it.
comments on this discussion?
Oh, look, it's always it's lovely to be with you, and and I love to show these fun things, and you obviously feel the same way, right? When you come across fun, clever things that stand out as impressive, that they are that they are, yeah, we should have fun. That
Yeah.
fun is sustainable.
And
We
we
can do
and we
that
should look at
any
both
year.
of them and acknowledge them and learn from them, and it's part of the wrestling, figuring things
Yeah,
out. David,
yeah.
any comments on this discussion? Anything you want to add?
Yes, I know neither of you claim to be experts, but it's been a privilege to listen to both of you this evening or this morning, depending where you are. And thank you both. Fantastic. I think we'll probably discover that there will be there'll be scholars who will not necessarily agree with everything that has been said or everything that Ganesh has written about. I think it's interesting, the poetic parallelisms, and I think the multi-authorship is also another subject to get into in a bit more detail.
Yeah,
And
in the next part, yeah.
there are lots of other details to get into. But it's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for including me in it. And I'm sorry my audio was not very good tonight.
Oh, not at all. No, it's been actually
You're fine.
great to
You're
have
fine.
you as well. And I'll just say I was sort of worried that I didn't want this to be too combative or contentious. I appreciate you, Ganesh. I think you're, a great sport, an absolute gentleman. I think this has been a good, I found actually an enjoyable, fascinating, edifying conversation as well. And I think it's important for critics and believers to engage with each other. I think that you've been very respectful as well, while we might come to different conclusions. And maybe some things I've shared you find interesting, learn from, and definitely things you pointed out. And I think we need to have more of these conversations as well. I would love to see more. Maybe my channel I could try to bridge faithful scholars and, critical scholars who are experts in these things to actually flush things out as well. But I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we have more to look forward to, talking about complexity, Book of Mormon, different authors, Nahum Bountiful, what else? Like the witnesses and other apologetics. But that'll have to be another part, because we'd be going like 5 hours if we did that. But it's been super fun.
Fabulous, fabulous. And we'll look forward to doing some more.
And listeners who've been watching, make sure you give this like and comment. I want loads of engagement in this. And if you've been enjoying this content, I'll try to see if I can arrange more of this discussions with people who have a different perspective. I think it's important for us to be challenged and to not be in our echo chambers as well. And also go check out David's channel. I'll put that in the description. And check out Ganesh's book, Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism, as well. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.